If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
What is the scariest paranormal thing, entity, or shadow being you've ever witnessed or experienced that no one believes when you tell them?
My father and I love mushroom hunting. We try to go whenever we get the chance. I also love walking in the woods, so it's like a win-win for me. It's just one of the most relaxing things I can do. I am from Italy, and we were holidaying in southern Tuscany in an area that we were not familiar with. My father had a friend who went mushroom hunting in the area, so he asked him if he knew any good spots to go check out. We were told to go to this village up in this remote mountain area and check behind the football pitch. We drove there, and the vibes were off from the start. Just a weird place, very run down, but I just thought it was because it was such a remote village. We start driving towards the football pitch, and I remember it feeling distinctly like Spirited Away, the Miyazaki movie. It looked like people were just there yet also abandoned. It was a freaky feeling. We park, get out of the car, and I'm frozen to the spot, crying as soon as I step out. Absolutely terrified with the certainty that I would have died there. I turn around and glance at my father, who is also frozen in place. My dad served in the Navy, and I had never witnessed him cry or become upset before, but that day he did. We look at each other, get back in the car, and drive away so quickly. I don't know what happened, but the fact that my dad felt it too meant that something was really wrong. Never again in my life have I felt that feeling of dread, knowing I would have died there. When we asked my dad's friend, he laughed and said, "Yeah, the woods do that sometimes." The freaky thing is that I told this story on a Facebook group years later, and someone pinged me asking if it was that village, which it was. He apparently had been biking in the area and got that exact same feeling in the exact same spot. My sibling and my father have almost always had something attached to them. We don't know what it was, but to my knowledge, it hasn't bothered them since. When my sibling, we'll call them D, came to my parents when I was in the 3rd grade and told them that they were seeing a tall black figure with glowing red eyes, we immediately called our old pastor to come and bless our house. When he was there, we all stood in a circle in the living room, and we started saying the Lord's Prayer. D was to the left of me, and my mother and father were to the left of them. About halfway through the prayer, D squeezed my hand so hard, I thought it was going to break, so I looked up at them and saw not D. D's eyes were completely black, and their face was not theirs. D was staring at the pastor like they were about to jump him and rip him apart limb from limb. It was literally 2 seconds of seeing that before D looked over at our mother and said, "What did you say, Mom? I swear you just said something." The pastor never completed the prayer, leaving our house unblessed. This entire ordeal resulted in numerous other events, not to mention the personal experiences I had in that house. I saw a Sasquatch, or skunk ape, or whatever you want to call it, crossing the interstate early one morning about 10 years ago. And there is no way it was anything else. It was covered in long black hair, running upright on 2 legs and easily at least 8 feet tall because it stopped and tried to hide behind a road sign for a second before running down the hill. It had to bend over to hide behind the sign, and when I later returned to the spot this happened, I noted that the bottom of the sign was above my head. Like I said, this thing was easily at least 8 feet tall, probably closer to 9. It was also very wide, like a linebacker. I once met the NBA player Karl Malone, and this thing would have dwarfed him. I never believed in Bigfoot, thinking they were just imagined by people who either didn't know what they were seeing or just wanted attention. I certainly didn't think they were in Louisiana. I am a rational person with a degree in environmental science and a healthy dose of skepticism. But when I saw that thing, my worldview shattered, and I was deeply disturbed for months afterwards. I spent the night at a friend's house when I was younger. He always mentioned weird paranormal stuff, noises, shadow people, changes in temperature. None of that prepared me for what happened that night. We tried to sleep in his room, but it gradually was getting colder and colder until we could see our breath. This was in the middle of the summer. So we decided to sleep out in the entryway of the house because it was the furthest away from the center of the house, and I was absolutely terrified already. Well, directly across from the entryway was an entertainment center with mirrored glass tiles behind it. So at this point we had been out there for a while, and I had fallen asleep on and off. Well, when I woke up, I was facing the mirrored tile and immediately noticed a face reflected in the tile. This face, this ducking face, looked like a mannequin head, all pale white skin, white pupilless eyes, rosy cheeks, and fake-looking blue eyeshadow. I asked my friend if they had one of those hairdresser test heads, and all he said was, "No, I see it too." I threw the blankets over my head and cried until I woke up in the morning. I believe I was 7 or 8 at the time of this story, but unless his grandparents were sick ducks and liked to prank terrified children, whatever I saw wasn't from this world. This is a story I do not often tell. I promise, sincerely, that this has scarred me for life, and although I have looked into psychological explanations for what I heard and natural explanations for what occurred, they remain unsatisfactory. When I was a child, I was scared of the dark. I swore to my mother I heard voices in it. They were not evil, but they were not familiar, and so they scared me. It was not uncommon in the middle of the night for me to wake up and hear whispers, as I would call them, when asking my mom. She figured they were just bumps in the night and typical kids' nightmare material. I tried often to explain to her that it was more than that they sounded different from one another the way people's voices do. On some nights I would get so scared from these whispers that I would sleep in my mom's bed with her. It was an added bonus that the bathroom was directly outside of her bedroom door for my late night tinkles. I should add at this point that when walking out into the hall to go to the bathroom, you look directly down the stairs that would lead you into my living room on the first floor, as my mom's bedroom was on the second floor. On one such night, around Christmas, I awoke and felt the need to relieve myself. I walked out from the door and distinctly heard the phrase "look." And to my astonishment, a red light, almost like a spotlight, was cast upon the wall at the very bottom of the stairs. The light had no other source, it was by itself, and I was transfixed by it. Being a little kid, and it only being a few days from Christmas, I knew what this light was. It was Santa. How else could he get into my house and know I was being a good boy? I was so excited I began walking down the stairs to greet him, picking up my pace after the second step as it began to creep off the wall and fade into the darkness in my living room. That's when I heard him. A very strong, masculine voice. Different from the first. Not at all like my father's, not to say he isn't masculine, it was just distinctly different. It said, "Stop. Right now. Go back up those stairs." I listened and turned around, and what happened next? I am not sure I would believe if someone had told me this same story. After reaching the top of the stairs, I heard a very loud crash that sent me running back to my mother's bed, where I jumped straight under the covers and stayed there the whole night. When we awoke the next morning, the poinsettia lights, little Christmas flower lights that glowed red, my mother had put on the railing down the stairs were pulled straight down to the bottom of the stairs, some broken from what seemed like a forceful tear, laying in a single pile. The dry sink in my living room had fallen from the wall. My mother could not explain it. My father was worried we had been the victims of a home invasion. My sister was crying. There was nothing missing, nobody had broken in, and there did not seem to be any reason this had happened. And then I saw it, and I kept quiet about it because I was so afraid that I could not force words out of my mouth. There, on the edge of the wooden dry sink, which had been facing up, were 3 indentations where the finish on the wood had been worn, almost as if in a forceful grip. Something down there had grabbed it and thrown it down. That was what the bang was. I was mortified. After that day I never heard a single voice again. I do not like to imagine what was waiting downstairs for me that night, if it was anything at all, but I can tell you that the reality was that something had physically acted upon 2 things in my house near the bottom of that stairwell. After this, I had never heard another whisper again. Which is sad, because in some ways I would have liked to thank the masculine energy that had stopped me from going down those stairs. This happened when I was 7. I am 20 years old now, and because of this incident, I am still afraid of the dark. Especially shadowy stairwells. Werewolf. I used to drive a garbage truck, the old school version with another guy hanging off the back, and he and I were sitting up front having our morning coffee and warming up before we started our day. We were on the side of a fairly main road, and it was still dark out. About 50 yards in front of us, I see what I could only describe as the biggest friggin' dog I've ever seen appear, run under a streetlight, and disappear as it ran across the street. When I say big, I mean it would have likely reached the height of a standing adult's chest. So of course I say to my companion, "Holy crap. Look at that huge friggin' dog." Across the street, directly from the streetlight where the monster dog emerged, was the entrance to a condo complex with another streetlight. Additionally, we noticed that if the giant canine stayed on its path, we would see it again when it got to said streetlight. So of course we're both staring intently at the condo entrance breathlessly, and when it broke into the light, no dog, it was a naked dude. And this is the dead of winter in New England, and I probably would have just written it off as mistaken identity or a trick of the light except for the fact that my coworker waits a beat and, without taking his eyes off the condo entrance, says, "Don't ever tell anyone that we just saw that, they'll say we were getting high at work or something." And I never did tell anyone, ever. I don't know about Bigfoot, Mothman, or anything else, but I'm pretty sure that werewolves are real. When I was about 12, my family moved into an old house that had been empty for years. The first night, I heard soft footsteps outside my bedroom door, but when I opened it, no one was there. Over the next few weeks, the footsteps became more frequent, always stopping just outside my door. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering, low and unintelligible, coming from the corner of my room. When I turned on the light, I saw nothing, but the air felt heavy, like someone was watching me. The scariest moment came a few nights later. I woke up in the middle of the night, unable to move, with a crushing weight on my chest. In the darkness, I could just make out the silhouette of a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall and shadowy, with no distinguishable features, just a dark presence. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The figure slowly leaned closer, and as it did, the temperature in the room dropped. Just as I felt it was about to touch me, the figure vanished, and I could move again. I never saw the figure after that night, but the fear of waking up to that presence still haunts me. Even now, I can't sleep in total darkness. I always keep a light on, just in case. I saw something, but no one believes me. For some context, it was about 9:10 p.m. Est in regional Australia, and I was sitting on a tire swing at a mate's house, just looking down at the phone when I put it down to see a shadowy figure that looked 3D, unlike a normal shadow, sitting next to my friend's neighbor's car in their carport shelter. They were about twice the height of the car and pitch black. They had sort of an Arby's mitten man with two big fat arms and a skinny body. The head looked very round on the top and slim down at the mouth. The lights turned off, and I instantly went into flight and ran back to their patio, where I was out of breath and just rattled down to my core. I tried telling people, and they said that no one was there and you were imagining it. I am mentally stable with no noticeable symptoms of anything in the schizophrenia disorders umbrella and take no medication that leads to hallucinations. Context: I'm an Aboriginal man, and shadow people are evil spirits who want to kill you because they fought with your ancestors and see you as the one to carry out all this legacy stuff. I still don't know what it is, and it's just plain scary. I have two stories, and both times, I had at least one other person with me. That being said, having someone to confirm what just happened has solidified my belief in the paranormal. When I was 15 to 18, every summer I went to the Appalachian Mountains. I did a 10-day mission trip where we would spend the time fixing homes and helping families in the community. When you went on this trip, there was usually a host school or church to hold us 40-plus teens. This one particular year our group stayed at a school that was built 10 feet from the old school that caught fire. The building was still standing, just unsafe and badly fire damaged. So of course, as a group of teens, we had to look around the abandoned building. There's 6 of us walking up and down all the halls, looking in each room, and just checking out the place. We managed to find about 200 of the sample size 1-by-1 school photos of what appeared to be a 3rd or 4th grade girl. After finding these photos all over the school, we found a room with a portrait-sized version. We're taking a standard 6-by-4 dead center of the room. At this point we assume someone is staging this to look creepy, and we laugh along. As we are leaving the school, we see someone or something leave a classroom and go into another. We get a little freaked out because we were the only ones there. So we have to check it out. The thing we saw came from a locked room and went into an empty room. No one was in the empty room, and we couldn't get into the room we saw it come from. All 6 of us ran as fast as we could out of there. The second time I encountered something unexplained, my best friend and I had the exact same experience. This happened 10 years ago, and we can both still describe the exact thing we saw. We were 17, riding in the back of a 4-wheeler in the forest near a lake at around 2 a.m. The only light we have is the tail lights illuminating the trail behind us. He and I are having a casual conversation, just enjoying being at the lake and going about 20 to 30 miles per hour in the dark down a long wooded path. Then it walked onto the path. Something around 7 feet tall, very thin, and fast walked across our path. We felt like time stopped, and it looked right at us mid-walk. The best way I can describe it over text is to think of classic Slender Man or Salad Fingers. Something very tall and lanky, lacking a face, basically walked across our path in what seemed to be 2 steps. I've never felt a fear like it, mostly because we both looked at each other and knew that just happened. 10 years later, we can both still tell the same story with the same details. We are hard confirmed believers in the paranormal because we've experienced it. Scariest encounter of my life. So this happened about 5 or 6 years ago. It was in the summer months, and my partner, our friend, and I were all hanging out and enjoying the summer weather. We were walking on a footpath near our apartment. There was a wide-open dog park to our right, and to our left was a bit of trees. This was broad daylight we were taking this walk, and the mood was very positive, and we were all just enjoying our time. As we were walking, I had looked up from our path at the area ahead. I saw something weird and asked the others in a light-hearted way, "Hey, do you guys see that?" with a bit of a chuckle in my tone. We all looked at the thing and stopped walking. We saw ahead of us, about 100 feet away, a somewhat large figure. It was human-sized, but the clothing it was wearing made it appear much wider. We didn't describe what we were seeing at the time, but we all saw the exact same thing. It looked like bulky dark brown robes or other clothing, covering any identifiable features, like arms and legs. The freakiest part, the mask. It looked like it was wearing a large, oversized Zulu-style mask. The mask top was higher than the head by about 1 to 2 feet, it was 3 to 4 feet wide, and the length of the mask came down to where you would think a human's mid-thigh or knees would have been. We were all just staring at it. I think we were all trying to comprehend what we were seeing. The even weirder part was that it wasn't stationary. It looked like it was almost dancing. It was kind of going up and down and side to side as if it was dancing, facing us from one foot to the other. We didn't panic, that is, until it started its movement towards us. It was the same sort of dance, if you can call it that, but the steps were now coming towards us. The part I think that truly made us panic was that it looked like it was dancing slowly towards us, but it was crossing distance at a completely unnatural speed that didn't match the movements at all. It looked like it was taking a step every 2 seconds, but it was moving toward us at the speed of a full sprint somehow. We all just started running full tilt away from this thing, as fast as our legs could carry us at the same time. We didn't stop until we got home and caught our breath. This was by far the most terrifying experience of our lives. We all saw the same thing at the same time. It was broad daylight. Have any of you experienced a similar sight? What do you think this could have been? I would think I was crazy, but we all saw the same thing. What the hell was that? In 2006 I rented an apartment with 2 friends across the street from the university we all attended. The apartment building was large, with probably over 50 tenants. Our apartment was on the top floor but closer to the parking lot. I would have strange vibes throughout the day, and it seemed to radiate beneath us, but I ignored it often. The people under us moved out mid-first semester, and that's when I started to have intense, violent dreams almost every night. I even had to sleep in the same room as one of my roommates because it got so bad. They didn't feel a thing. I would come home, and things in my room would be broken, but no one else was experiencing this. In the last month of the last semester, I went to study at the school and realized while I was there that I didn't have my keys on me. I knew I grabbed them before leaving because both of my roommates said they wouldn't be sleeping at home that night, so I double-checked as I walked out the door. I know I didn't drop them either. Well, I walked back to the apartment because maybe I dropped them in the hallway. At least someone could allow me to re-enter the building. No one was around, it was really late. So I waited until my roommate showed up to let me in. They were going to stay out later, so they handed me their keys and said to just unlock everything and bring it back to them so they could leave. As I went walking towards the building, I looked up into my room and saw a large black humanoid figure standing there with beady red eyes. I froze as I watched it walk through the wall into the hallway. Our hallways and stairwells had big windows, down a flight of stairs, and through the wall into another app that I knew had a kid living there. I heard the kid scream, and the lights turned on. I immediately walked back to my roommate's car and asked if they could drive me to a motel that night. Needless to say, I was never alone in the apartment after that. I was too scared to be and didn't renew the lease with my friends. Years later I found out a coworker had lived in the same building at one point in time, and she experienced the same thing. Intense nightmares, mood swings, rage, and she saw the figure I recognized one night while sleeping on her couch. It really helped me feel justified that what I was experiencing at that time actually happened. No one ever believes me when I tell this story. Has this happened to anyone else? This happened to me when I was around 9 and my little sister was 3. It was nighttime around 10 p.m., and I was playing computer games on my desktop that was in my room. My desk faced the wall opposite the door in my room. I heard something hit the wall beside me. I turned around, and there was nothing there. Now as a kid, I just figured I was tripping and got back to playing my game. But then it happened again. I turned around again, but this time when I did, I saw my sister walking down our stairs. Mind you, the stairs were literally right next door to my room. I couldn't see down them from my room, but I could see when someone would go to walk down. My little sister was so small at the time that our parents would give her one of their big t-shirts to wear when she went to bed sometimes. When I saw her, I called out to her, but she didn't answer. She just walked down the stairs. I know 100% that I saw a small figure in an oversized white t-shirt walk down our stairs. I got up and headed towards the stairs, but I didn't see her. I figured she had run down, but it was weird because she was scared to go downstairs by herself at night. I ran downstairs to see what she was doing, but all of the lights and the TV were off. Only light on was a little sculpture case that my mom put ornaments in. I checked the kitchen and living room, but she was not down there. I ran back upstairs to find her asleep in our parents' bed. My mom was at work, and my dad was in the shower. My sister, dad, and I were the only ones at home. As a child, I dismissed it and continued with my activities, but now, as a 26-year-old man, the memory haunts me deeply. What the hell was it that I saw that night? This isn't my story but my father's. For clarification, I have permission to speak it. So in case people don't already know of the route. Sherman's Pass. It's near the Colville area, heading to Republic in Okanogan County. For clarification, Okanogan County has morbid shit. Like flesh pedestrian ranch shit, flesh equals skin, pedestrian equals walker. To get on with the story. My dad and his girlfriend just last year were heading back home from a date night trip thing. When they took a turn to this thing in the road. My dad's girlfriend pointed out to him this object-looking creature in the road, passenger side specifically. She looked at it confused. For emphasis, he was doing 30 miles per hour and slowed way down to avoid hitting this thing. Once they were at a distance, they were able to see it more clearly. They thought it to be a really black cow. But once he got closer, this thing wasn't a cow but this weird entity. As he got even closer to it, he said it looked about 7 feet tall. Way bigger than his truck. Once he maneuvered to the left of it. He said it looked as if it stood up. Getting from what he said 3 times, its height before he punched the gas, speeding past this thing. They both said after they've passed it, they felt really uneasy about it. Like it wasn't a good thing. A heavily malevolent thing. My father claims to have seen the same shit periodically throughout his life. I brought it up to his girlfriend and him a few days ago, and they immediately got goosebumps, telling me to immediately drop it and stop speaking of it. I don't know what it was, but it scared the shit out of them. Probably gave them trauma. He went to a few people who live around those parts. They quickly denied telling him anything about it. Different subject. But my father claimed to have seen shit like this throughout his entire life. He saw this as really defined. Unbelievably crystal clear spirit orb in a picture. He went to someone who majored and knew a hell of a lot of them and told him, be very careful, that's not a friendly spirit. It had basically the entire rainbow spectrum in it, surrounded by a yellow aura. Any help on what this may or may not mean? Both the shadow and orb? I was a real estate photographer back when I was in my early 20s and still living at my parents' house. Back then I used to take my car alone at night just to listen to music and get out of the house. So I do just that and end up driving for a good 45 minutes into a small town I don't really know, just turning whenever I feel like it and then stopping in front of a house. It's probably 2 a.m. at that point. Looking at that house, there were these windows in the roof like those Canadian houses have. For some reason, I feel like someone's watching me, so I look over there, and as I do, the curtain goes to the side like someone's looking. But there's no one, pitch black, behind the curtain. I just smile and think to myself, you can't get me from here, ha. Then just smile and decide it's late. Gotta go to bed, I've got a shooting the next day in the morning. So I just start the car, continue a little on the road there, turn around in someone's driveway, and get back home. The next morning, I wake up late, of course, as I went to bed so late. Shooting was at 10, but it was 9:45, and I had 45 minutes of driving to do to get there. To my surprise, it was in that same town I was in the night before. Anyways, jump in my car and start feeling kind of dizzy/sleepy for some reason. I'm stressed out and tired, it must be it, right? Anyways, I kid you not, I got to that house in 10 minutes. I got in the car at 9:45 and got the address on the GPS at 9:55. But wait. The house I was going to take pictures of was the same as the one the night before with the curtains. WTF. Anyways, I see the agent's car, I figure they're inside, so I get my tripod and camera out of the car and decide to go in. The garage door was open, so I figured I'd go from there. As I approach, a Doberman with reddish eyes comes at me and starts to bark like crazy, looking like it wants to eat me. Then the owner of the house comes out the side door and tells the dog to calm down and go back in the backyard. I was like, okay, wow, that's a well-trained dog. The guy tells me to come in, as others are already inside. As I get in, I get this odd feeling that something isn't right. Nothing about this is right. The owner starts talking with the agent about how the house is haunted and that you can hear kids playing upstairs sometimes, etc. Being sensitive to those things, I was like, having known, I would have refused that gig. As we're moving along in the house, we can hear like kids running upstairs. I figured they had kids. Going room to room, I was left with the upstairs. As I go up, the agent I was with comes down, says he's never coming back there and leaves. I was like, okay? Expecting to see children, nope. No children. All doors were closed in the room, so I opened the first room. Masters. For some reason, it was pitch black in there, couldn't do good pictures. I get to the doorknob to open the next one, it opens on its own. I tell myself, Jesus Christ, time to go. I speed things up and take a couple of pics. Getting to the last room, there was a bed with a pile of laundry on it and a big tiger plushie. Set my tripod and clicked to take a picture. Part of the picture was blurry. So I take another one. Still blurry. I look closer, it's like someone was jumping on the bed, making the things on it bounce when I was taking the picture. Knowing very well there were spirits of kids in this house by now, I just said out loud, "Alright kids, don't move while I take this picture." And got my picture this time just fine. As I was leaving the room, the tiger's head turned and followed me. Then many other things happened that I'll cut short, but I ended up leaving the house at like 4 p.m. with all my batteries dead after maybe 100 pictures. Those batteries usually lasted me for weeks. I left without taking the outside pictures as it was getting dark. When I came back the next day for pictures, I talked to the neighbors about the dog that wasn't there that time. They told me there had never been a dog at that house. I could hear the kids playing outside in the yard. There were no kids. I did some research on that house afterwards. It turns out the family that lived there in the early 1900s was one where the father ended his wife and 2 young daughters in the woods behind the property in cold blood one day and then ended themselves. I'm sure those were his daughters playing and that the house was still haunted by that guy to this day. When I was around 6 years old, I would wake up frequently at night to use the washroom. I'd look down the hallway, towards the bathroom and my sister's bedroom. And for a while without fail, I would see this really tall, dark figure standing in my sister's bedroom. It was as tall as the doorframe, maybe taller, and I would see it wrap its fingers around the doorframe, and then it would slowly peek its head around the corner at me from my sister's room. It would just stare at me, but it never came towards me or left my sister's room. It had big eyes, and it resembled a man, definitely not a woman. It had no hair or facial hair. It was dressed in all black. I would refuse to go towards it to use that washroom. Instead, I would run through the complete darkness, while holding my hands like makeshift blinders at the corners of my eyes, all the way down 2 flights of stairs to my dad, sleeping on the couch. To take me to the bathroom on the first floor, and he would take me back up to my room, but the figure wouldn't be there anymore. This all started happening just before my mom and dad were going through a really tumultuous divorce. At this point my mom slept in their bedroom, near my own, second story, and my dad would sleep all the way in the basement. My parents had an extremely toxic relationship, screaming and yelling constantly. Throwing stuff at each other. Followed by my mom being unfaithful with my dad's best friend. Now that I'm older, I often wonder if the entity was attracted to the negativity in our house. This still brings those scared shitless tears to my eyes when I think about it. I've never seen anything like it since. I hope I never do. I was traveling with some friends on some 4x4 trails in southern Idaho. We were camping out one night, singing music around a campfire for quite a while, and my friends decided to go to bed. My ex and I stayed up a little longer, hanging out around the fire, just enjoying the atmosphere, and then everything got dead silent. Like the world got put on mute. I'm no stranger to this phenomenon. It generally happens when there's a predator nearby, and being in bear country, I had my bear spray on me, so I wasn't too worried. My ex and I continued to enjoy the fire until we heard someone way off in the distance say, "Honey, honey, honey." You could tell it was far away, but it also had the sound of a whisper rather than a yell. The tone seemed almost questioning, as if a woman was calling out for her husband. My friend peeked out of his rooftop tent and asked if we were the ones calling out, but we weren't. The weirdest thing is that it didn't sound right. It sounded more like a woman calling out honey, rather than an actual human woman. I couldn't put my finger on what it was, but the more rational side of us decided it may have been a hiker. The moon was full, so the idea of a couple hiking at night, especially since we weren't too far from the nearest town, wasn't too unlikely. My friend and his GF decided to rejoin us for a little bit, and they also commented on the lack of wildlife sounds. We sat for a few more minutes before, again, hearing that honey, honey, honey sound. My friend agreed it didn't sound right at all. He called out hello just in case there was some poor lost woman somewhere, but nothing responded. A few minutes later, we heard the same call, but from the complete opposite direction. With how far out it sounded, there's no way some lost hiker could have circled all the way around our camp that quickly. We lit up our floodlights, booked it out of the area, and ended up cutting our overland trip short. I still don't know who or what caused those noises, and they continue to frighten me. Not sure if I'll be traveling to southern Idaho again. In my early 20s, I started experiencing sleep paralysis accompanied by a dark shadow figure. Sometimes it stood still, while other times I felt it was trying to physically remove my soul. This would happen every now and then until I was in my 30s. And while it freaked me out when it happened, I didn't put much thought into making it stop. Nor had I ever described it to anyone. In my mid-30s, I was visiting a friend in Colorado and sleeping in the same room with him. In the morning he described that he woke up in the middle of the night and swore he saw a shadowy figure crouched on top of me while I was sleeping and appeared to be eating me. He said he shooed it away by yelling at it and went back to sleep. We thought it was creepy but assumed it was a weird dream and went about our day climbing a mountain. After my spiritual awakening, which I'll describe more in a follow-up comment here, I figured out how to make this stop. But a few more things happened after that. About a year after I managed to stop it, my brother unexpectedly shared with me his own experiences of being haunted by a shadowy figure, which bore similarities to mine. And they even described some of the same figures I saw. Which I also saw some describe here. A large humanoid figure with red eyes. I even drew him in one of my journals, which is in storage RN, but I wish I had it. Finally, I managed to stop them. I had a dream/other dimensional experience where these entities threatened to come after my daughter if I did not let them off their leash, so to speak. I told them to try it and went on with my life. Unfortunately, a couple of years later, when my daughter was about 8, she did start having visual hallucinations, as her therapist described them. Though she herself called them monsters or shadow creatures. It became so severe that we had to put her in therapy because she would not be in any room by herself and started having behavioral issues at school. Which I think helped, of course. But in the same way someone described here, I confronted them and told them to back the duck up off my daughter and come for me if they were going to come for anyone. Eventually we got this under control as well. However, not long ago, she is now 10, I was walking by her room and saw a shadow figure shaped as a deformed cat jumping off her bed. I asked her later if she still saw them, and she said that she did, but that she was no longer scared of them. The creepiest thing about that conversation is that I never told her I saw the shadow figure that looked like a cat jumping off her bed, didn't want to scare her, but in that same conversation she told me she had named him Shadow Cat. When my husband and I were only a year or two into dating, we went to this beach often, especially for sunset. It has a lot of history for our town. It's basically a small peninsula, big enough for a parking lot in the middle, surrounded by 10 to 20 of woods, and then the outermost ring is the beach. We walked a path toward the middle/point of the peninsula, approaching the tree line. A singular palm tree blew in the wind so hard it was bent somewhere between 45 to 90 degrees. No other trees or bushes near this tree moved. There were no words exchanged, we both just turned around and walked back quickly and silently. We drove for 5 minutes in silence, and finally I said, "Did you see it?" He said, "You saw it?" I felt it. He didn't see it, but I did. It looked like a Dementor, floating over a picnic table someone had dragged out to the sand/beach. Pretty sure I saw a demon. Over a year ago I was forced to move out of my apartment due to a serious mold problem that was making people sick, and the management refused to remediate it to the extent we needed them to. They did as little as legally possible, basically. Because all my things were essentially caked in toxic mold spores, it was a huge effort to thoroughly clean what could be cleaned and bring the rest to the dump. We didn't thrift them because the contamination was either too difficult or just not possible to clean certain items, like couches and mattresses and things like that. My SIL was helping me sort through everything I owned to determine what was worth keeping and cleaning. I lost most of my belongings. While we worked, she kept saying she felt uncomfortable in certain rooms and couldn't shake it. I didn't think much of it. We were alone at night, and suggested we move out to the brightly lit porch. Every now and then she'd turn back inside to grab a box, tool, or whatever, and then she said that she saw some shadow figures. She said she didn't say anything earlier because it might have been her imagination, but now she was sure. Well, we had done a lot of work, so we decided to just wrap things up and leave. On the way to the car, she glanced back at my unit and froze. She then says, "Look in the window. You don't see that?" I didn't notice anything unusual. She then held firmly onto my arm while trembling slightly and said, "How do you not see that? It's right there." She was apparently seeing a shadow figure, clear as day, looking right at us. Even though I didn't see or feel anything, the fact that she was standing behind me, tightening her grip on my arm, and now had tears in her eyes was enough to give me pause. This woman is no actor. She was terrified. So now I was pretty spooked myself. We got in the car and left. She said the thing followed us with its face. I don't think she could see discernible eyes, as we drove past. We said some prayers to Saint Michael and others. Later, I talked to her about it, and she reminded me that one of the prayers we prayed was the Hail Mary, and when we prayed that one specifically, the shadow being's face distorted or glitched, but it didn't leave. I have had my own possibly paranormal experiences, but the scariest one was the one I didn't directly experience. My boyfriend, a couple of friends, and I were on a road trip from Texas to Washington. I had driven the previous 8 hours, so I was sleeping in the front passenger seat while our oldest friend was driving. He's 31, the next oldest is 24. At one point I was sure I was having a dream. My mind said it was about 3 in the morning because it was pitch black through the windscreen. When I looked over at our older friend, I could see he was just staring at the road and driving, but he looked a little stiff. Outside the window, beside him, I thought I saw a deer's head, but instead of passing by the window, it was staying in pace with it, and every once in a while I could see the flash of an arm, like someone was swinging it when running. Then I woke up the next morning in the parking lot of a convenience store. Everyone else was gone except me and the older friend. I asked where everyone was, he said bathroom, and we just sat quietly until I told him about my dream. The more I told, the paler he got until he looked me dead in the eyes with the worst look I have ever seen. He looked about ready to die of fright. He told me that I wasn't dreaming, that when we were all asleep and he was driving, he had seen something pale in the trees on the side of the road. He kept going, thinking it was a different kind of tree, as he saw something similar a couple of times after, until one of them began to move. When he looked in the rearview mirror, he said it looked like someone was running after the car, but it wasn't falling back like he expected and caught up with the car, despite us going a good 75 miles per hour. According to him, it was an average-sized man with a deer head from the collarbones up. He tried driving faster, but it would still keep pace with the car. He tried to not look at it, but he could tell it was still there and stayed there for a good few minutes before he got to a well-lit area of road and then a city. He didn't have the heart to look into the rearview to see where it had gone. I don't know if he was ducking with me or not, but he refused to say anything about it later, not even to my boyfriend, who he treated like his little brother. It terrifies me to think of what it could be. I've heard something similar in Native American lore, but it's not supposed to be a good omen, so I try to push the matter out of my head as much as I can. When I was 7, my mom and I had just come cross-country to stay with my grandmother. She was a monster herself, but that's a different story. We ended up staying in her spare room, which she used as a third closet for all of her over-shopping, clothes, old dolls, jewelry boxes, etc. hoarder. Every night, starting on the first, I began to see a pair of what looked like glowing red eyes. I wasn't a stranger to seeing weird crap, but these spooked me. At first I tried to tell myself they were my imagination or some impossible reflection in a pitch-black room. But it happened every night, and they'd be coming from different spots each night. At first they'd stay in one spot all night, but after the first week, I began to actively watch them move about the room, always staring at me and never breaking my eye contact unless it dodged behind something. Despite the mess, they were always silent. By week 3, I was terrified, as it had begun to inch closer to the bed at night rather than around the perimeter of the room. I finally got the guts to wake my mom one night as it was approaching the bed again. As she woke, it retreated but didn't disappear. My mom saw it after I woke her up and explained. She froze. Eventually, she got up and turned on a light to investigate, only to find it gone. But turn the lights off again, and by the time she's back in bed, they've appeared, and they're watching and darting again. We checked the room for days after to try and find a rational source of the 2 red glowing eyes. We never could. After that, each night, we'd huddle together and watch the thing dart around the room, watching us. Eventually it got to be too much, and we had to move downstairs into the living room. Weird stuff happened down there too, but nothing like that. I had 2 odd encounters. This was in college. I was living alone on the outskirts of the city in a 2-story house. As I was sleeping, I could suddenly see the room as if I was standing above my bed, but I was still sleeping. At the moment I started noticing that something very tall and thin was behind the windows. It would block the light, and I could see its shadow. It teleported to a nearby window, didn't move, and just appeared at another window suddenly. It tried to push it open, and I started panicking but could not move. I started screaming, but my mouth wouldn't open. When I realized my body wouldn't move, my astral body appeared in front of the window where the creature was, and I screamed and punched the glass, and the creature ran off, and I was able to wake up. That was my only case of a sleep insomnia demon, but it was real and terrifying. I checked the window, and it had smudges on it. Something was there. Third was in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan near Lake Usuk-Kul. My wife, girlfriend at the time, and I took my little siblings and some cousins camping. I found a cool spot with beautiful nature way in a valley in the mountains. It was next to a huge river and a local farm where they had horses you could ride. I set up all the tents and started a fire, cooked some hot dogs and potatoes, and made s'mores. It was a great time, and when the fire died down, my wife took all the kids in the big tent, and they were telling scary stories to each other. As I was listening to their stories, I smoked a cigarette and noticed a satellite or a star that was moving and told the kids to come out. We stared at it for 20 seconds, and as it was right above us, it got way closer to Earth, it seemed, and made a slight stop for a second before slightly changing angles and continuing on its trajectory and going out of sight. I paused to see if anyone noticed, and they all said, "WTF was that?" I said that might be aliens or someone with a drone, but aliens are more likely because we are in the middle of nowhere and there is not even cell service here. They freaked out, and I lit the fire and made more s'mores to calm everyone down and get them to sleep. About 2 or 3 hours later. It was around 3 a.m., the horses on the farm nearby started going nuts. Just wild screaming from them like a wolf was in there, and then it got quiet very fast. I felt something weird in the air, woke up my wife, and told her to be ready to get into the car with the kids and drive if I tell her to. The horses were screaming for 10 to 15 seconds before just unnatural silence filled the space. When I stepped out of the tent, I opened the trunk of my LX 470 and took out a shovel and a taser I had along with a flashlight. I started looking around and about 70 meters from us saw a huge black wolf. It was bigger than any wolf that I have ever seen and looked like it came straight out of Twilight. The flashlight wasn't that powerful, so I couldn't see anything besides that it was weirdly big and dark. It looked in the direction of the horses, then turned to me, took a couple of steps, and then I decided to start up the car and turn its headlight toward it. It stood still until I started to turn the car, and before I could see what it was, it purposely stayed hidden in darkness and ran off. I don't know how to explain it, but I didn't feel anything malicious from that creature. I just went back and told my wife that it was just some dogs barking and went back to sleep. About 30 years ago, when I was in college, I went camping for a few days in some fields just outside town with 3 friends. On the last night with twilight setting in but not completely dark, we all saw this vague black shape slowly appear about 10 meters away. At first I thought it was my eyes, but then others saw it. It seemed to get gradually more dense. This is going to sound weird, but it was like a dark black shadow mass with shimmers of silvery dots and lines very faintly visible all over it. Imagine the classic graphic illustration of a computer network superimposed faintly on a black blanket that's just hanging in the air. That's the closest analogy I can find for it, and one I probably put on it retrospectively as those types of illustrations were maybe less common at the time. From memory it was maybe 5 feet high, 2 or 3 feet wide, and kind of like an upright fat sausage shape, except less clearly defined than that might suggest. Shortly after we had all been alerted to it and were looking at it, this thing suddenly moved from one side of the campsite to the other in a swift, wavy motion. It came within 3 or 4 feet of the nearest person and caused them to leap up. Then when it got close to bushes on the other side of us, it seemed to just evaporate. It was so bizarre we had no idea what we had just seen. I remember we were kind of stressed by the experience, which sounds odd, but it was so bizarre it actually really disturbed us. We saw the night out and never saw it again. After a while I think we convinced ourselves we imagined it. Like it wasn't a curious woo thing, it actually felt kind of horrible, like, WTF, are we going crazy? I still feel weird even thinking about it all these years later, like this weird feeling we had when we saw something we weren't supposed to understand or know about. Which itself sounds crazy and was maybe just me projecting an intelligence that wasn't there. Maybe it was a collective hallucination or some kind of hysteria. A swarm of fireflies? I don't know. But it was creepy as hell and genuinely terrified us. To this day I have no idea what it was, but 4 sober 17-year-olds all apparently saw the same thing. When I was 4 years old, I was staying in a provincial town in the Philippines with my mom. I would bathe with a tub of water that we would refill whenever we got the chance, as there was no running water. At the time my mom would help me shower, so she'd use a tabo, which was basically like a deep ladle, and pour the water over me and rinse the bubbles off. I close my eyes as the water washes over my face and open them again when it passes. This happened a few times until I opened my eyes and saw something suspended in the top corner of the bathroom, staring at me. It was a bit contorted, human-like, and naked. It looked kind of smiley. But I remember feeling dreadful, sad, and scared and immediately told my mom as she continued to rinse me. By the time I finished my sentence and the water washed over me again, it was gone. My mom comforted me and told me everything was okay. Years later, when I was 20 and living in the States, I recall what I saw to her, and she believed me because apparently she had seen it too. She even said she remembers the moment when I told her in the bathroom because she felt it but went about normally as to not scare me further. No proof otherwise, but I know what I saw was real, especially how it made me feel. Haunted house in the woods. This is a story about my experience of the paranormal in a remote village. I was in my maternal uncle's house with 2 cousins, and around 11 p.m. one of the neighbors called my cousin brother, asking for the key to his house, as he was there last. So I will give a description of the area first. It is a really remote village, roads came recently, and before that, we used to walk through the woods to travel through the village. And also houses have big distances between them, like 200 to 250 meters. So after the call, 3 of us went to his place. The way was quite creepy because after roads came down to connect the village, that woody way was hardly used, and it was getting covered by big grasses, etc. When we arrived, we found a wooden house, roughly 2 stories high, with no rooms on the ground floor. Instead, it served as a former cow shed, now devoid of any cows. The upper floor, where they resided, was occupied by no family members at the time, and he had only recently moved in after several months. We went up, and my cousin told me he had kept the key up there, in the ceiling, and when he was searching for it, the key fell down. They sent me to get it. I went down through the metal stairs but was having a creepy feeling. I had a torchlight, and it just went off. I turned it on, got the key, and ran back up. We went in, had some drinks, talked a bit, there were 4 of us, and then decided to go to sleep. 2 of them slept in the bed, and 2 of us slept on the floor. I and the person on the floor weren't sleepy, so we decided to listen to some music because there was no internet service in that area, and we had some songs saved on the phone. After hearing a noise from the floor, we thought it was a wood-eating insect but found nothing. We ignored it and listened to music, but that noise was not stopping, so we searched again and tried to find the source. It was coming from the ground floor, like the ceiling was scratching from down there, as the noise was also moving from one corner to another. We got spooked and decided to ignore it because only 2 of us were awake. After a while, we heard metallic footsteps coming from the staircase. Now we were panicking. Their kitchen was not in the same building but was next to the house. After some time, we literally heard utensils being thrown from one corner to another like there was some fight going on. We were just so scared at that point we decided to just cover ourselves with a blanket and not open our eyes or move. The next day we went back and shared this story with our cousin's brother, and he said that our neighbor's brother took his own life a long time ago, and he was relating it to that, but I don't really know what it was. I've had numerous instances where I've experienced the paranormal for some reason. But anyways, this was my story. I'll start with one night in summer 2012. I was with 2 friends standing outside a gas station when we noticed an incredibly bright light directly above us. To give you a mental image, this was in the middle of town, so there was plenty of light pollution, and yet, this light was still nearly blinding. Friend 1 went in for cigarettes, while friend 2 stayed out, staring above. I made a joke or two, but friend 2 was totally zoned out staring at the light. At some point, friend 1 comes out and notices friend 2 completely dissociated. He also makes a joke, but friend 2 doesn't react whatsoever. We literally have to drag friend 2 into the backseat of my car. That's when everything gets weirder. We're driving about 20 miles outside of town back to my parents' house and we are several miles into this journey when we notice the light is following us. It's moving in a straight line, keeping up with us, stopping at lights when we stop, and picking back up as we go down the highway. Friend 1 and I are totally freaked out at this point. Friend 2 remains silent and slack-jawed, staring out the window at it. We finally get back to my parents, and at this point, we're eerily calm about this situation. The light is directly above us again, moving almost with liquidity. It can move in small ovals, figure eights, backwards, and forwards, and is showing us all of these motions. We lay in the grass, watching it. It finally just disappears. Friend 1 stands up and vomits. We realize friend 2 has been on all fours and vomiting for some time. I'm somehow fine. Friend 1 is lucid and was like, "That was so ducking weird? I wasn't even feeling sick?" Friend 2, "Let's get you up, buddy." Friend 2 becomes uncharacteristically aggressive. It takes several minutes to talk him down. I ended up putting him in the backseat of friend 1's car, where he lay down and immediately fell asleep. The next day, I texted them both like, "What a ducking night, right?" Friend 1, "For real, what was all that about?" Friend 2, "What are y'all talking about?" To this day, friend 2 remembers nothing about that night beyond arriving at the gas station. For a long time, he thought friend 1 and I were trolling him about all of it. Another spooky story on par with that experience. I was staying in an old penthouse in Oaxaca a few summers back. I woke up in the middle of the night and saw a bearded man standing in the room, clear as day. Confused, I thought it may have been my friend I was staying in the room with for a moment. I rubbed my eyes and readjusted my focus. Nope. It wasn't my friend, and it was definitely there. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I remember thinking, just look away. I did, for a few minutes, then looked back. Still there. He turned towards me and faded out of vision. I remember feeling eerily calm. I really needed to use the bathroom, so I forced myself to walk through the area where the guy had just been. It felt odd. Drafty in a room with no air conditioning. The day before, I'd been at the penthouse alone, finishing up some work, and heard people talking. I assumed my friends had come back early, so I yelled something at them. No response, but I can still hear them. As I proceed down the hallway in the direction of the noise, I can still hear them. As soon as I arrive in the living room, it's like a stereo was suddenly turned off. There is no sound. I check their locations, and they're over a mile away. I go back to my room and hear it again. I assumed I was losing my mind. When I was 7, my family, mom and 2 older brothers, 13 and 15, moved house. We moved to a street that was built on old tram tracks from around the 1900s. The line of terraced properties itself was fairly new. When we moved in, they were only around 15 years old, max. All of the properties have a rear garden that is divided by a meter-tall wooden fence. Each garden has a shared rear wall that is 7 feet tall and made of concrete. This wall separates the properties from the grounds of the local park. This is all relevant, I promise. As a kid, I kept myself entertained. The age gap between my brothers and me at that age was enough to be left out of things, and my parents were recently divorced. I would make up games and act out imaginary scenes. It was not uncommon to find me playing by myself in the back garden. We had pet rabbits that lived in a hutch that was up against the back wall mentioned earlier. Being the curious child I was, I used to like to stand on the hutch and look over the wall into the park and people watch. I remember it being a warm night, and the sun was setting a bit later in the day. I don't remember the time exactly, but with the way the daylight plays in my memory, it was around 7 p.m. I was out in the garden, people watching from my rabbit hutch vantage point when I had the sudden urge to look over my right shoulder. With the way my house is laid out, the kitchen is at the rear of the house. If I were to enter the house, I'd open the door and walk through the kitchen. My neighbor's house, which would be on my right as I looked back, is a bit different. Their sitting room is at the rear instead. So, I look over my right shoulder, and my neighbor's back door is open. There are no lights on, so it's dark in the sitting room, and I can't make anything out, but I know they have a sofa facing out, and it would be where I was looking. I see 2 red dots, spaced apart and not changing distance from one another, floating in the middle of this black room. I remember squinting, trying to figure out what I'm seeing. I shit you not, these 2 dots move in a smooth arc to the right and upwards, as if they were eyes on the face of someone standing up from the sofa. As they move, they seem to get a bit closer to the door, and I can make out nothing except for a dark silhouette. I freak out and run back inside, all the way to the front of the house where our sitting room is located, to tell my mom. She assures me it's nothing, and I head back outside. I climb back onto the rabbit hutch and immediately look behind me again. The figure with its red eyes is now standing in the doorway of their house, looking out into the garden. I step back into the house once more, but this time, I don't go back outside. For years, I forgot about this experience, but I've always been afraid of the dark. I especially hate looking out of windows at night, particularly into the back garden. Something jogged my memory of it a few years ago, and every time I talk about it, it makes me want to cry because it scared me so much. I still remember every damn detail of that evening, and I wonder what it was I saw. My neighbors still live there, and I'm too scared to ask them if they've experienced anything or if they have an explanation for what I saw. The apartment I shared with a friend almost 20 years ago was haunted. It started with nightmares of an old man trying to grab one of us in our dreams. We screamed a lot in our sleep and woke each other up. The intensity increased when someone knocked on our first floor windows, which required a high ladder to reach, and when the apartment doorbell rang at night. When I immediately opened the door, the hallway was empty. We started to sleep in one bed. We were frightened. My roommate's boyfriend stopped sleeping at our apartment because he was scared. One night we lit some candles and switched on the CD player, but someone blew out the candles and switched off the CD player multiple times. Someone didn't like us to have any light. So we just tried to sleep. We heard a noise. My roommate whispered, "There's someone next to me." We heard fast steps next to the bed. We screamed and jumped up, switching on the light. Next to us was a small table with a bowl on it. The bowl moved. The bowl shifted slightly before tumbling over the table. We spent the rest of the night locked in the bathroom and moved out. My father's house has always been, for lack of better words, spooky. It's a very old house, built in 1901, and it has seen a lot of people and survived quite a bit of history, like the 1913 flood of Dayton. My stepmom moved into the house when she was about 5 years old and told us that an older lady was murdered in the home before her parents bought it. Her mom found a pair of broken glasses and a sock of hidden jewelry in the basement, which were supposedly the women's, and she has stories upon stories of strange events happening as she grew up in the home. Stories of having the shower curtain ripped open when no one was home, loud bangs, a piece of Easter cake going missing but then found on the basement floor, seeing shadow figures, and cups sliding off tables, to just name a few strange occurrences. In the early 2000s, her parents won the lottery and bought a farm about 30 minutes away and sold my stepmom their home, which, after marrying my dad, became our weekend home as well. Only a few things happened to me while being at my dad's in a span of about 15 years. Once, I felt rushed by some paranormal force while lying down on the couch, and I've had the front door open and close while no one was home besides myself. My dad had one of those old barred iron glass screen doors. The scariest event was one late night when my dad retired to bed, blowing out 3 glass Christmas tea lights that sat on top of the fish tank, leaving me downstairs alone. I was playing on the computer, and it was late, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning. I hear glass break behind me, so I turn and see my cat looking up at the fish tank, and I stand to see the farthest tea light on the left, broken in half and lit. I knew no one would believe me, so I took out my dad's digital camera and took a million pictures, which might still exist somewhere. Other than that, the hallway, staircase, and basement give off the scariest vibes. It feels like someone is behind you, and walking down the stairs feels like you might be shoved. Even my kid doesn't like going upstairs alone because it scares him. Anyways, the point is the house has a long history of just being strange and the generations of fear. As an adult, I decided one night that I wanted to find evidence of a death occurring in the house. I searched tirelessly, and while I had a specific murder victim in mind, I did find an obituary and death records for a woman who had died in my dad's house. Her name was Sarah Slife, and she died in the house due to liver and kidney failure in 1934, about 46 years before my stepmom moved in. She also had about 3 small children who died very young and could have potentially died in our house as well, depending on when they originally moved in. When we found the records, we also got a photo of her, and I showed my stepmom, and she swears she has seen this woman in the home before as a child. So creepy. I have a woman researching to recover the original deeds and see if there are any more recorded deaths in our home. Just thought I'd share with all of you. I am a 23-year-old male living in rural Ireland. A bit of context before this happened. I'm not sure if they are linked, but I will mention it. Context: I've never had anything paranormal really happen to me, until about a year ago when 2 separate things occurred. 1. I and my friend were walking home at night when, in front of us, an old man looked like he just stopped dead in the middle of the road. We thought nothing of it, thought he was maybe drunk or something, but he didn't move as we were getting closer and closer. All of a sudden he turned around, and it was like he had 2 bright, yellow, piercing eyes staring down at us. It could have been a light, but we were freaked out. We didn't move and just stared at this until he suddenly walked away. This whole thing occurred for about 5 minutes. Weird, right? The same friend's dad picked me up one day from my house. He gave me a watch that he said he found on the side of the lake canal, usually where we go fishing. Ever since he gave me this watch, I feel like I can't get rid of goosebumps, and I just feel like I get unlucky. My driving test got cancelled, close friends of mine fell ill, and a lot of other bad stuff happened, such as crashing my car, my friends crashing their car, etc. This one is a bit far-fetched, but I just wanted to mention it anyway. I still have this watch, and the ticking is so loud on it. Maine. One night, I was walking home, around 10 p.m., when I suddenly heard what sounded like a door slamming shut. I thought nothing of it and continued walking. However, it happened again, and this time, I heard 3 separate slams, as if 3 different doors were banging shut at the exact same time. This started freaking me out. I just continued walking at the same pace. It was about 10:30 to 11 p.m., but what was weird is that no other cars or people were in sight, which I've never seen around this time. When I got next to the sound, I looked into the house and saw it was a black dog. The dog had a metal bowl in its mouth and was banging it on the front doorstep. I started laughing, feeling a bit of relief, but the dog turned and faced me. I've never seen a dog act like this. The dog stood up and just wouldn't stop staring at me. Didn't make a sound either, just stared at me. Eventually I walked past the house, but I felt goosebumps like I never have before. Not sure if it's because I was scared, but I still have never felt this feeling before. Like something was behind me. I genuinely felt like I was in immense danger. Anyway, I went home after that, and nothing strange has happened since. Thanks for listening, and please comment anything below. I love listening your stories and thought I'd share mine. Also, if there are any experts, please tell me what this was. This all happened outside the same house mentioned with the dog and the old man. My family and I lived on a farm, and back in 2008, about 6 months after my father died, my mom came across 3 books on witchcraft and spells. We lived in a poor, farm-based county in SC, we were from FL. She wanted my adult son and me to donate them to the local library. I said, "Duck that," and took them off to the burn pile that our farm helper had left going. Son went and got the golf cart, we had 75 acres, and we tooled on over to the pile, which was in front of the steel barn and away from everything, so there was no chance of stuff catching fire. It was a lovely, warm afternoon, no breeze, no clouds in the sky. So I ripped up a few pages and threw them in the fire. Suddenly, this very loud, icy cold, howling wind came blowing over the top of the steel barn, crashing down on us, and flared up the fire that was engulfing the pages. It died down in under a minute and returned to the quiet, breezeless afternoon again. Son and I exchanged a quick glance and exclaimed, "Holy shit," simultaneously, at which point he grabbed the book from my hands. He ripped a bunch out of the book and tossed them in, and no joke, the same thing happened again. The loud, roaring, icy cold, very strong wind came blowing over the barn again for about a minute, flaring up the flames, then immediately died again. After 17 times, yes, 17. We were well over the humor of this extremely weird event, and it was taking forever to burn these stupid books at this pace. So he took the remainder of one book, I ripped up the remainder of the other, we looked at each other, and then we tossed both into the fire together. Oh my ducking God, the noise was so extremely loud, so bitter cold, and so very strong. The flames erupted, and it was really bad for maybe about a minute or so. Then it all disappeared just as fast as it had arrived as the pages were turning to ashes. Nothing remained on the farm until 2015, a week before the closure in late May, when an entity, neither human nor animal, moved into the house. I'd hear it opening and slamming shut cabinets and doors when I was alone in the house, as did my son and his girlfriend when I wasn't there. Not our problem, it was the new owners to deal with. 2014 was a bad year for me. The start of it was the worst. I live in a 2-bedroom townhome alone. Antisocial. One night in January, I went to sleep around 12 or 1 a.m. Per usual. I ended up waking maybe a few hours later, so probably very early in the morning. When I awoke, the first thing that I thought of was, who's in my house? Is mom here? Is sister here? I thought it was weird that I would awaken this way and immediately start asking these questions to myself. I typically sleep on my stomach, but for some reason I was on my side. I heard the soft depression that feet make in the carpet at the foot of my bed. There were 4 steps. I'll never forget that. I was now very aware something was in here with me. My eyes were still closed. Ever so slowly, I millimetered my hand towards the baseball bat I keep by the bedside. This silence, with my hand creeping toward the weapon, continued for about maybe 2 minutes. I felt something putting weight onto the edge of my bed, and it moved forward to where I was lying. My hand was now just barely touching the bat. I remember thinking only this is it. I have only one shot. But what happened next has haunted me for the last 2 years. It's made me mostly unable to be alone at night, and especially to be anywhere, any place, without knowing where some kind of weapon is. Something grabbed the back of my neck, at the base. It was cold and somehow wet. Not in a watery kind of way, and not in a gooey kind of way. I can't describe it. I don't like thinking of it, actually. In one swift movement, I grabbed the bat and swung down with it as hard as I could right above me. I ended up kicking my own ass, bruising my leg. Nothing was there. I sprang from the bed about 4 feet to the light switch and illuminated the room. There was nothing here. The only sound was the fan now running, since it shares the switch with the light. But I knew what I heard, and I knew what I felt. I touched the back of my neck, and there was no residue. I knew something was still in here with me. I started to probe the room, bat in hand, and would jab empty spaces. I checked all over. Except for a tiny space between the dresser and the corner of the room, by the window. I felt flushed at this moment. I knew something was standing right there. I approached the corner slowly, with the bat outstretched, gripping it tightly. I was making my way closer until I started to feel extremely drowsy. Unnaturally so, like I had just drunk a gallon of NyQuil and sleeping pills. My knees shook, and I sat down on the bed. I dropped the bat. I lay back and fell asleep. A few hours later, in the morning, I woke up with the light and fan on, and my baseball bat on the ground. I sat up, and I realized I had fallen asleep since the time I was probing the room. I made my way to the sliding glass door, which is always locked. I have no reason to go outside IT, and check IT nightly. It was unlocked. Something was in my room that night. Something saw me grab the weapon and try to harm it. Something was hiding in the corner and used some sort of hypnosis on me to escape. Something has never returned, but I always live in fear of it coming back. When I was around 12, I moved to Hong Kong and stayed in a new house that my parents bought. I've always felt some type of way in the house, but I couldn't really tell. The first time that I've seen something unusual was when I was going down the stairs around 2 to 3 a.m. On the second floor there is a fish tank, and something like a female head popped out of it, but I thought that I was too sleepy. I did tell my parents, but they told me I was crazy. I didn't think much of it until the next time I encountered them again. After a year or two, I began receiving home tutoring from a new teacher. She told me to go to my room and get some books, so I went downstairs. My room's light switch is on the left, aligned with the door, and once you open the door, my bed is in the center. So when I opened the door, there was a dim light coming into the room, but I'm pretty sure I saw something squatting next to the edge of the bed. And in a split second, it looked like the head or something turned when I opened the door. I was freaked out, so I took the books as fast as I could and left. Finished the class, and I wasn't going to go back to the room, but eventually I had to sleep. Up until then, I was still iffy about it, so I actually decided to go into my room really quick, and I told myself if I see nothing, I'm sleeping there. But the same thing happened. I opened the door and saw it. However, this time, it was situated on the edge of the bed. I ran to my parents' rooms and asked to sleep on the couch. Told them everything, but they said, if you don't bother the entities, they won't bother you. They might just be here to hang out, like we hang out in different places. But it just so happens that you sometimes are able to see them. So my 14-year-old self decided to trust in my parents. But I never slept in my room again. The night I experienced the scariest paranormal experience I have ever had. It's what made me believe beyond a shadow of a damn doubt that there are otherworldly beings that interact with our world. I've shared my story on here before, so sorry, guys who have read it. I'll just give a brief description. Had a couple of experiences in the house before this, but I couldn't exactly blame it on the paranormal. I didn't want to either. I tried to rationalize it, but this house was just eerie from the start. Anyway, this night my family and I were next door playing darts and having a good old time. We go home. I had the upstairs to myself since my middle sister was at our friend's, staying the night. I get into bed, and I hear my stepdad call my name from the bottom of the stairs. I yell back to him. He yells my name again. I yell back to him. Lol, this goes on for what seems like forever until I finally start getting pissed. Why isn't he coming up here or telling me what he wants from me? Shit. I throw the covers off me and start to get up, yelling what one last time. I feel like whatever it was could sense the aggression in my voice because right after the words left my mouth and I was almost off the bed, its voice changed. It was not my stepfather. It sounded like two voices together, an old lady and pure evil. You could kind of make the distinction, but they were one voice. And it started screaming my name at the top of its lungs. I have never heard anyone scream so loud in my life. I flew back into the bed and hid under the covers. It finally stopped, and I stayed under the covers all night. And somehow I fell asleep fairly fast for what I had just gone through. All I just knew was that I was not coming out from the covers. I tried to think of all my options, and there were none. I couldn't jump out the damn balcony, and I damn sure couldn't get down the ducking stairs. But anyway, that voice still gets me. At that moment my first thought was this is not of this world. And it scares me that whatever it was tried to lure me down the stairs by using my stepdad's voice. Who knows what it was or what it was trying to do. I do not ducking know at all. I saw a ghost as a child, and no one believed me. I've been an insomniac for the majority of my life, and I've always tended to be awake in the early hours of the morning. I was awake when the world, people, and plants all slept under the rhythmic twinkle of the stars and the calm lull of unconsciousness. When I was 7, an odd age for me, my family was preparing to go on a trip. When everyone was settled in, anticipation and excitement doing nothing to disturb their slumber, I would be awake, and I would twirl about my room like a hummingbird circling a flower or a feather floating in a gentle breeze. However, that night, I wasn't the only one moving about in the darkness. It started with the rope. In the backyard of my childhood home, a wonderful and magical place that I loved dearly, We had an old wooden jungle gym from the previous owners. It had a thick, black climbing rope that was heavy enough it took a great deal of natural force to sway it. But in the windless, breezeless night, it swayed. Not in a gentle rocking motion, but aggressive circles around an invisible object. Though I didn't understand it at the time, I was terrified by this sight enough to start crying. I ran into my bed, vying for the protection of my littlest pet shop blanket. I covered my ears, though I don't recall why I needed to.
Eventually, I, a very brave 7-year-old, worked up the courage to take a second glance.
The rope continued to spin violently, and I know I saw the hand that caused the movement. It was blue and foggy. Like smoke trapped within a humanoid frame. From the frame, I could have guessed that the person was male and a young man. Still not a scary scene. Something about this simple sight with simple actions devastated me greatly, and I began sobbing quite loudly. Enough to wake my elder sister up to check on me. She didn't get the chance to see the melancholy blue boy and didn't believe that I had actually witnessed anything. But that night had taught me something important about ghosts. Ghosts aren't people, they are feelings and emotions that stay behind as an echo of the individual that's moved on. These feelings may be that of fear, anger, misery, or even happiness. But they stay, and when you've sensed or seen a deceased loved one, it's not their face or voice you recognize, it's the echo of one lost long ago. It's in their behaviors, their habits, and their unique traits. Death is what happens to the people who got used to those things and are suddenly left bereft of their familiar routine. I've had encounters through dreams and in my waking life, but none of these ever taught me like this experience had. When I was 18, I was hanging out at the river with 2 friends, and we were waiting for the third. My 2 friends decided to walk down the road a little, and I waited for my cousin by the bridge. I was just walking over this 1-lane bridge when I saw this big guy walking toward me. He looked angry and violent. It was weird because he had this strange grayish quality about him. He was wearing overalls, but not the kind you would expect to see someone wear in 2010. In any case, he was approaching me with an air of anger. Then my cousin rode his bike right through him, and he was gone. I was terrified, and my cousin saw him too. His intention was to hit him with the bike, and he was literally freaked the heck out that he went straight through him. Another weird thing was waking up one night in a hospital room with those paper blinds they used to have drawn mostly closed. A nurse was going over some paperwork with me, tapping each bullet point with her pen, pointing them out. She was silent. I took the pen and signed. She then walked down the side of the bed to about the middle of the end of the bed and disappeared. The entire scene dissolved, and I was in my room at home. I was maybe 17 or 18 at the time. I'm 32 now, and to this day I have no idea what I signed, but I know it was real. It was too vivid not to be. I even saw the dimmed lights in the hall past the curtain and heard the sounds of nurses and beeping. It still terrifies me. Last one for you. I was outside smoking a cigarette with my coffee at my then boyfriend's house. I was in my 20s then. My then boyfriend, his brother, and their friend were inside. I heard a horse neigh and then the sound of a large animal running at me. A large, black, winged horse shot out from around the side of the house and took off in a flash into the sky. I sprinted inside, clutching my cigarette and my coffee, completely terrified. They ran outside because they'd heard it too. They heard the same thing I did but got outside seconds too late. We had just moved to a new house, and my 2-year-old child was sleeping fine in the office we converted to a nursery, so he was next to our room until he was comfortable with the new house. Suddenly, our child isn't sleeping well and, with their limited vocabulary, is having trouble telling us the reasons why. What I could understand was pretty freaky. The stories revolved around people observing them from outside their room, among other things. I believed them because, as a kid, I saw some really crazy stuff, and my parents never believed me. I wasn't going to do that to them. One night, I'm lying on their floor next to their little toddler bed, holding their hand so they could go back to sleep. I'm just sort of staring into space out the glass pane door to their room, trying to stay awake so I can get up and go to bed in a few minutes. All of a sudden, I see a tall, dark figure, taller and longer legged than my husband, walk past the room. After pausing just past the door, where you can just see a sliver of it, it turned around and stood directly in front of the door for a minute before turning and walking back to the stairs. The whole time I looked at it, I could feel this sense of dread and terror and tried not to move, hoping it would leave. Once I got over the shock, I hadn't seen anything like that for years. I left the room and walked through the house, confirming my husband was still asleep and there was no one in the house. I told my husband the next day, and I don't think he really believed me. I even left out the feelings I was getting from what I saw. He blamed it on having a couple-month-old babies and being sleep deprived. He did it in the nicest way possible because he knows I've seen things before, and he himself has had experiences as a child. It wasn't until multiple toys randomly started going off on their own in the middle of the night that he agreed we could cleanse the house. The scariest night of my life. I've been struggling to understand what happened for years, so I figure this is as good a place as any to share. This happened the summer before my senior year of high school. I would have been 17 still. I'm 23 now, and I still think about it often. I and my two best friends at the time had decided to get together one Friday night and hang out. We lived in a pretty small town, so there wasn't too much to do, and we mostly just stayed indoors. At some point, we all decided to go for a walk down the road. As I mentioned earlier, it's a small town with minimal traffic, especially at night. There had been some logging done a couple of weeks prior near my buddy's house we were staying at, and after a couple of minutes of walking, we came to where both sides of the road were cleared out of trees. On the left side of the road, there was this really faint orange glow coming from where the cut-down trees ended, as if there was a fire going somewhere in the forest. The moon was very bright that night. I don't even remember having to use my phone light to see. Still not sure why, but we just decided to go towards it, off the road and into the cut-down trees. We ended up walking for what felt like a good half hour, not really going too fast, as there were a couple of hard-to-traverse spots with tons of fallen trees. Eventually we got to a point where we couldn't go any further. There was a really steep drop-off for what seemed like the whole length of the tree line. I found out it's a ravine. If I had to guess, it was probably about 20 feet to the other side, so there was no hope of getting across. On our side of the ravine, there were nothing but cleared trees, but on the other side, the trees started just a few inches after the ravine and were very dense. I remember feeling really disappointed at seeing the ravine and the forest on the other side just out of reach. I stopped right at the edge and bent down to catch my breath, and one of my friends lay down looking at the stars. My second friend was standing right next to where I was kneeling, staring across the ravine. At this point it was after midnight. I remember pulling out my phone to check the time and then looking back up. And that's when I saw it. On the other side of the ravine, just 2 or 3 trees deep into the forest, was a pale white figure, standing in between 2 trees. I froze immediately, and I couldn't look away from it. It was very humanoid and looked to be about my height or taller, 5'10", almost as if there was a man in a costume standing there. But everything in me told me that wasn't a man standing there. I was terrified to move or take my eyes off of it. I just knew if I did, it would come across the ravine at us. I worked up the courage to ask if anyone saw that, and out of my peripheral I saw my friend next to me turn his head at me. At that point I was terrified because I realized that's what he had been staring across at the whole time, and he had just confirmed I wasn't seeing things. I heard my friend from behind ask, "See what?" And not even a moment after that, before either of us could answer him, there was the loudest whistle I have ever heard. It sounded like someone had gotten right up behind me, bent down next to my ear, and whistled right in it. But it wasn't any sort of whistle I had heard before. It was very deep. I still occasionally hear it in my mind. I guess this was what we needed to snap back to reality, though, because as soon as I heard the noise, I turned around as fast as I could and started running and saw both of my friends had the same exact idea. There was not a word said the whole time. We were all 3 running very frantically back through all of the cut-down trees. I remember being so terrified that if I slowed down for a second, it would be on me. I remember making it back to the road first and stopping to wait for my friends, but not even seconds later they both came crashing out together, and we all kept booking it to my buddy's house. It was a 30-minute walk, but we made it back in 5 easily. We got to my buddy's driveway and all collapsed. I remember thinking I might have a heart attack because my heart was beating so fast, and we were all scraped and bruised from the trees. After we all got calmed down and cleaned up, I remember staying up for a couple more hours just huddled around inside researching and talking about what happened. I and my friend that was next to me both agree we definitely saw some pale, white figure, and all 3 of us heard the whistle, but my other friend to this day still says he never saw anything, only the whistle. My friend next to me says he remembers feeling the exact same fear that I felt when I described seeing him out of my peripheral, confirming what I saw. He said that as soon as I asked if they saw it, he knew it wasn't fake because I was seeing it too. It's been 6 years, and it still is so vivid when I think about it. Safe to say none of us go walking after dark anymore. After all the research we did, we agree it could have been the thing that shall not be named. Yeah, I won't even type the name. That encounter scared me too badly. Even thinking about it makes me shiver. I don't want to fully place the blame on that, but it's the closest sounding thing in everything I've read. If anyone could shed some light on this, I'd be forever grateful. This happened a few years ago. I had just moved into a new apartment with my best friend at the time. She was gone at work, and I was in the kitchen cooking. Randomly, I hear her call my name clear as day, Cass. It startled me because I knew she was supposed to be at work but quickly assumed she came home early and wanted to talk to me about something. I kept cooking and just yelled back, "What?" Then I hear it again, "Cass." Even more clearly, but it sounded like it was coming from outside the front door. I thought maybe she had forgotten her key or something and was calling for me to come unlock the door for her. But when I opened the door, no one was there. Now I do believe that our minds can do weird things without explanation, and I'm not closed off to the reality that it could just be an auditory hallucination or something explainable. But what was so different about this time is that it happened twice in a row, in her voice specifically. I remember briefly thinking maybe something awful had happened to her and her spirit was calling me. But I called her cell phone, and she was perfectly safe and sound at work. My wife and I's experience. We need answers. So we were at this lake house with some friends, and my wife was at home all night by herself while we were at the bar drinking a little bit. I didn't have much to drink. I had like 1 or 2 beers. I got back to the house, and I lay down. It was pretty much pitch black in this room, but I could just see the silhouette of her body while she was lying down. I lay down next to her, and we were face to face, but I couldn't even really make out the details of her face. It was so dark, but I noticed that it kind of looked like she was sitting up. And so I just said, "Hey, why are you sitting up? Or what are you doing?" And I heard her voice come from right in front of me. Not where it would have been if she was sitting up, so it spooked me, and I just kept staring at this thing. And the more I stared at it, the more I realized that it wasn't right above her. It was on the edge of the bed, standing, hovering over the bed. And it was this black figure that was like 8 or 9 feet tall, and as I stared at it, it slowly started to get a lot closer to me, but it was just its face. Like it looked like its face was extending out to stare at me. It ended up getting to the point where it was inches from my face, and I just sat, and I was like, shook, frozen in space. I couldn't move, and I was just staring face to face with this black figure that had these little bitty bead orange eyes with these tiny black pupils. And I'll explain the rest of what it looked like once I explain the rest of the story. But my wife looks at me, and she's like, "What? Did you see something?" And I froze, and I just said, "I don't want to say anything." And she was like, "You need to tell me if you saw something." And I said I did, but I didn't tell her what. And we sat there for a minute. I was just like, "Don't freak out, just relax, go to bed," and she couldn't, she was so scared. So we both just ran out into the main area where all our friends were. And so, we get out in the main area, and she's like, spooked. She's like, "Guys, I think Jackson, me, just saw something scary, and I need to tell you about the things that I was seeing while you guys were at the bar." And she starts explaining. She's like, "It felt like somebody was standing outside the door, because she could see light, but it looked like the shadow of 2 feet just standing outside the door for hours. And then she would fall asleep and wake up, and it would be gone." Well, she could see a little bit of light underneath the door, so she said she saw this shadow figure crawling on the ground, walking towards her on all fours. And when she told me the details of what this thing looked like, I froze. I could not move. She said this thing had little orange eyes and a huge smile with these jagged teeth, and the reason why I froze is because that was exactly what I saw, and I never told her that before she told them. It was the spookiest feeling I'd ever experienced. Well, while she's telling them, they kind of start laughing a little, thinking she's joking, but I was not laughing. I was freaked out. Didn't want to even talk. Just staring. Blank space. Absolutely freaked by what she just said. I just felt like what I saw justified everything I ever believed, right? Still hadn't told her that's what I saw, because what happened next happened so fast. Well, while she's sitting there talking, I shut the door to that bedroom when we got out of there. But while everybody's sitting there talking, we all heard something drop and fall onto the floor in that room, and there were wood floors all throughout the house. And so we walked through the bedroom to kind of see what it was, and there was nothing on the floor. Like, nothing. There wasn't any trash. There wasn't a coin. There wasn't anything that was on the floor. The floor was spotless. So, that was the only thing that we saw. However, later on, we discovered that there was an Indian burial site in the backyard of this house, with the tombstone still visible in the small fenced-out area directly outside the window we were staying in. So I'm not sure if there's any kind of folklore about those types of spirits, demons, ghosts, or whatever it was. But still to this day, this was about 6 months ago, I've yet to find out any information on it. It still spooks us when we talk about our experience. I mean, I'm still getting chills telling you this story, and I haven't really spoken about it since. But yeah, what do you think? Obligatory, I know this sounds fantastical and wild, and I agree. This is in fairly remote backcountry West Virginia, which is known for being old and haunted. It was experienced entirely by 2 of us, but the worst parts by all 4. This led to all 4 of us at some point battling personal issues in our lives that I believe stemmed directly from this encounter. The following is, at least to my memory and what I've been able to corroborate with the other people that were there, 100% accurate and true. When I was 17, 2004, we had a terrible experience camping near haunted train tunnels and sites of sudden tragic death. History of the immediate area: 1 square mile, mother and son are drowning in the creek nearby. Drug dealers were killed in a state police shootout at a nearby hunting cabin, and many, many years before, cheap laborers had been killed building this double set of train tunnels. They were actually buried in a long-forgotten little graveyard nearby the tunnels that has since been found and restored. We decided to go camping before graduation as a friend group of 4 just to do something one last time before we all went our separate ways in life. This is private property on the backside of a big hill around which the creek flows in a huge, several-mile-long bend. Camp set up, fire going. Shortly after nightfall, my cousin and I sat on the creek bank, maybe 20 yards away from camp, spotlighting fish in the water. We began to hear a rhythmic slosh of what sounded like someone wading through the water maybe halfway up their shin deep, so we shined the light around upstream. We then spotted the symmetrically and rhythmically consistent disturbance made by what looked and sounded like invisible feet/legs sloshing towards us. When we turned the spotlight off, it would start. It would stop when illuminated. It was reacting to us, and this was the first ice bucket stomach clench moment. We knew this was not fish and could not rationalize what was happening. This scared us pretty badly, but we decided it was best to keep it to ourselves and join the others gathered at the fire. As we made our way back, we heard the sloshing make it to where we were on the bank, and the noise stopped. Given the speed we witnessed it moving and how far it was from us when we were watching it, it must have sped up to make it to the bank we were on in the amount of time it took us to get back to camp. The campmates heard it and thought we had gotten in or riled up some fish, but we ignored it. It sounded and looked like an invisible person was wading toward us through the water. After the noise ended at the creek bank, we all saw the tall grass disturbed as something we couldn't see ran around the foliaged perimeter of our circularly cleared campsite. This could have been an animal, but it was fast. We then began to hear what sounded like a man talking to us, as in speaking into the ear of each person, the left ear, if that matters. At first it sounded garbled, but after maybe 15 to 20 seconds we could make out the words saying we shouldn't be there and we needed to leave, before finally addressing us directly and saying slightly more forcefully, "You need to leave." Not only was this terrifying, but we thought someone was walking up on our camp, which is dangerous. We were all frozen with fear, but then adrenaline hit. As we freaked out and started to run to our ATV, all 4 of us saw a tall black shadow man wearing what looked like a hat, relaxing against the front of our ATV. It straightened up when we saw it, and it saw us. It just sort of hung there staring at us for a few seconds. No feet. The legs ended in sort of wavy lines, like looking above the fire at the heat waves. It stood out against the dark night behind it. The girl screamed, which broke our fear freeze, and it zipped like a flashback toward the train tunnels people had died in. Interestingly, when we went to start the ATV, it turned over sluggishly as if the battery had been slightly drained, despite working fine not long before when we rode it down. This entire event happened over the course of maybe 5 to 10 minutes and within an hour of the sun going down. After putting our story out there, I received a lot of feedback from people who have also had bad encounters in this area over many years. Even a guy I worked with, who I didn't know knew this area, told me that my uncle had hired him to trap in that area, and it was the only place he didn't check traps alone at night. He said it was almost like the animals left that place at night. No less than a month later, my uncle, who owns the property, was up on the hill raccoon hunting at night with a dog. At some point, the dog was on a rock face up above him and knocked a large rock loose that fell and struck my uncle in the side of the neck. This understandably messed him up pretty bad and paralyzed almost his entire body, but he still had limited functionality on his left side. We could never figure out how he got himself back to his ATV, turned it around, and drove himself out of there. My uncle didn't text my mother unexpectedly until 2 or 3 years later, around Halloween, when my story began to circulate on local Facebook groups. You have no reason to take my uncle's character reference seriously, but he is a humble individual who engages in hunting, farming, and hard work, even going beyond his retirement as a millionaire. Honest, funny, and just an incredibly stand-up guy. He is easygoing but also no nonsense. In his text to my mother, he said, "I've never told anybody this before, and I probably won't again. The man in the hat the kids saw at the creek that night helped pick me up off the ground and put me back on my ATV and get me turned around. I had always thought the shadow man was trying to scare us out of there, but now I think he was whispering to us to leave and avoid something scarier and more dangerous, though I have no idea what that was. I remember when I was little I once saw two big yellow eyes in the mirror in front of my bed at night. I was 10 years old, I think maybe less. I remember calling my parents, and after they came to see, the eyes never returned, but I asked my father to remove the mirror after a few days. Another time I was 16, I saw my dead grandfather watching me sleep and my dog barking at him. He didn't seem scared. He was really tall, with blue jeans and a Scottish shirt, white hair and beard, but no face. I have never met him since he died when I was 1 year old. It scared me a lot because I didn't have time to realize that there was someone, and he had already left. My mom showed me one of his shirts with a red and green Scottish pattern, and in that moment I understood that it was him. Another time, 12 years old, I heard my mother calling me when I had just returned home, but my mother was at my uncle's house. I waited to answer for a few minutes, and when I went to look for her, she wasn't there. She arrived at home after 2 hours. Growing up in a Mexican household, my mom and I never had the best relationship. I was 9 when it happened. At school, I faced bullying, and at home, I experienced poverty and reprimands for my laziness. I didn't talk much as a child. I didn't think I had anything intriguing to say or that anyone cared about what I thought. I tried to talk to anyone about something that scared me for the first time, but no one believed me. We used to live in a 2-room trailer. My family was a family of 6, including me, my 3 siblings and 2 parents. My sister and I had a small room to ourselves, my brothers would take the other room, and our parents would sleep in the living room/dining/kitchen. Note, I am the oldest of the 4, and usually that meant I had more responsibilities than my siblings, also taking into account that I am female. My siblings and I were walking home from school one Friday. I remember it being a hot day. When we got there, we did the usual routine, turn on the TV to watch PBS Kids, wait for mom to cook dinner or make sandwiches, take a nap, etc. I was watching TV when my mom suddenly got between the TV and me and started screaming at me. I don't remember what she was yelling at me about. I just remember she was infuriated with me. My siblings went to their rooms while my mom grabbed me by the shoulders and just yelled. I was crying, and my anger was growing. I remember screaming at her through my tears when out of nowhere, she slapped me. I slapped her back but not as hard as she did me. To this day I regret it. I have asked for forgiveness from her and have never done that in my life again. We were both shocked by the events that unfolded. She started to cry too, and I could tell she was stressed out. I just couldn't understand why or what was causing it. I ran to my room crying and lay down on my bed, drowning out the screams in my pillow. My sister left the room to watch TV. I fell asleep. Indeed, I wept myself to sleep. It was good sleep too. One moment it's the afternoon, hell broke loose, and the next I open my eyes and it's pitch black. But the thing is, I didn't just wake up on my own. I felt like something pulled the blanket that was on me. I shrugged it off and uncovered myself, thinking maybe I was just having another one of those dreams where you feel like you're falling and you jolt awake, but also, it was very hot. When I uncovered myself from the blanket, the room felt so fresh. I saw my sister in her bed on the other side of the room, and I tried going back to sleep. Not a minute goes by. Something grabs my foot and pulls me down, as if it's attempting to drag me under the bed. I immediately sit up, and I see a black hand firmly gripping my foot. Sometimes, I still sense its presence, and that memory remains etched in my mind forever. I panicked, and I yanked my foot away from its grip. I stay sitting down on my bed, breathing heavily, trying to process what just happened. Was it real? Did it actually happen? Yes, I could still feel its grip around my foot. I tried leaning over the side of the bed. I wanted to run, but I didn't want it grabbing me as soon as I stepped on the floor. I prepared myself, and I bolted out of the room into my mom's bed. I felt awful and guilty about leaving my sister behind. But I was a child. I was scared. I woke up my mom and told her what happened. She replied with, "Okay, go back to sleep." I did as she said. Tried to. I slept at the end of the bed by her feet. And I tried my hardest to go back to sleep. Eventually sleep did take over, but it was restless. The next morning my mom asked me why I was sleeping in her bed. I told her what happened again, and she did not believe me. She said I was just imagining things, and it was my guilty conscience because of the way I behaved the day before. I learned to keep quiet about it. Since that day, I have never slept with my feet uncovered. I do not care if I'm roasting like a chicken under those blankets. I am getting crispy, but I will not be taken. I had also acquired a deep fear of the dark since then. I will absolutely not sleep without some kind of light. I learned it the hard way too. A couple of years ago, I accidentally went to sleep in the dark, and for the first time ever, I experienced sleep paralysis. As the years have gone by, I've experienced a lot of paranormal things. But those are stories for another time. What I can say with certainty is that I have never felt alone. It's like it keeps following me, or it wants something. This thing has watched me grow, it has watched me suffer, cry, laugh, and sleep. Has anyone else ever experienced something like this? I have yet to talk to someone who has. This is also why no one ever believes me. As I sit on the couch watching TV in the living room in mid-October, I hear something moving in the attic. I played it off as some rat or something even though we never had any problems. So I turned the TV down to listen. I could hear what sounded like something rustling around. I turn the TV off. I suddenly hear what sounds like footsteps. It's coming from directly over my head. Then there was a loud thud, as if someone had slammed their foot. Immediately after the thud, the disturbance in the attic went away, and now there's a quiet scratching sound on the window. The sound that's coming from the window could not be caused by scratching it with something. They were consistent in length. They lasted approximately 2 seconds. The screeching sound starts to creep me out. It's coming from the very bottom left-hand corner of the window. I'm too frightened to look. There's a 2-second screech with a 2-second pause. It continues. About 1 minute into the screeching, I pulled out my phone to tell my wife. She's at work at a bar, and I can hear the people in the background. The screeching on the window continues as she answers. As I begin to explain why I called her, she blurts out, "What is that sound?" I ask her, "What sound?" She said it sounded like nails on a chalkboard. She said it was so loud she had to pull the phone away from her ear. And immediately I dropped to the floor freaked out. There was no phone interference on my end. How did she hear it? And suddenly the screeching on the window stops, and I explained to her what had transpired. This happened years ago but still gives me chills when I think about it or tell it. My pawpaw Doug died in January of '98, and my little brother was born in December of '98. They've never known each other. My family lived on some land owned by Pawpaw. In fact, all his children did. The 3 houses were built side by side and were within walking distance of each other. Starting with our house, my dad, who was his middle child, lived in a newly built modular home. The middle house, where my Pawpaw and Nana lived and raised their children, was later passed on to his youngest daughter and her family. The last house, where his oldest daughter and her family resided, was owned by his oldest daughter. We were all somewhat tight-knit growing up. During a family barbecue and bonfire in the summer of 1999, our kids began to hear ghost stories. I hear my mom say to my aunts that she needed to speak with them during this time. They go inside to get more marshmallows, and I follow, saying I have to use the bathroom. I didn't, I was just nosy lol. I sat in there with the door cracked, and I heard my mom asking them questions about my pawpaw. Like what kind of cologne did he wear? And did he have a distinct stance and posture? And would he have liked my little brother if they had met? They answered her questions, and I could tell something was off with my mom afterwards. A few days later, on the way home from an outing with mom, I asked her why she was questioning my aunts over the weekend. Her answer legit scared me as a kid but also kickstarted my love of the paranormal. She said that at least once a week, the toilet in my parents' bathroom would flush on its own, and when she would go check, obviously no one was there, but she'd smell cigarette smoke and manly cologne. My pawpaw Doug passed away due to lung cancer caused by his smoking habits. The lights would even flip on and off by themselves in the bathroom. She proceeds to tell me that occasionally she'd wake up and my little brother would be in his crib laughing, and she'd see this shadow figure standing and hunched over his crib. It never scared her, she said it was almost a calming presence. Fast forward a couple of years later, and my mom is driving me and my siblings to the park for a family fun day. During our journey, we notice a large cemetery to the right, where my pawpaw rests. As we are passing by it, my little brother, who is in the back seat, starts laughing and waving towards the cemetery. I asked him what he is doing, and his reply stopped us all in the middle of our convos. Keep in mind, he never once met our grandfather or even knew his name other than Pawpaw. He said, "That's where Pawpaw Doug sleeps." We asked him, "How do you know that? How did you know his name?" And my brother replies, "Because he would play with me in my crib when I was a baby. He told me his name was Doug. Like my daddy and my brother, now my dad goes by DC, and I go by my nickname, Trey. Not once during this time did my brother ever know our real name. He only knew Daddy and Trey." Talk about chills running down my spine. Every time we passed that cemetery, my brother would smile and wave and say, "Hey, Pawpaw Doug." Every word of this is totally true. It's one of many paranormal things I have experienced. Nobody ever believed me. Hello, I've personally experienced some paranormal activity. Throughout my teenage years, especially. A few months before all these paranormal stuff started kicking off, my grandma passed away in late March. It was a shock to the whole family. It was sudden. I was 13, turning 14 that year. That was my first time in a chapel as a Protestant and the first funeral I ever went to. I am a Protestant, but my mom's family is Catholic. In May or June of that year, things began to kick off. One night I was making myself a cup of tea. It was 1 a.m. or something. I know it was late. I had a ducked up routine back then. I lived in a bungalow with my mom and older sister at the time. The halls were always eerie at night. Even when I was younger, they were one of the scariest, most dull places, with no windows, full of doors, and some lights. Only one light worked, the other bulbs were blown at the time. The kitchen door handle was broken, so we always had to put a brush to hold it up. We had 2 dogs. That night I went out after making a cuppa, turned off the light, felt eerie, and turned the hall light on. Then put the brush up. Soon after I went into my room, I heard a light switch from the kitchen. I paused right in my tracks and went back out. The light was ducking on. I freaked. I turned off the light, quickly brushed up, and was scared. I went to tell my mom. She didn't care. Not a single care about it. She told me to go to bed. I never really slept that night. The next day I told my dad about it. He blamed it on the fact I had blocked ears. Sometimes I get blocked ears. It wasn't that at all. I felt misunderstood. The night after the first incident, I was in the living room on my own. The door handle opened, nobody was there. I thought it was my mom. I was absolutely terrified. I was in a rush of a panic, screaming to my mom. I stayed in her room that night. I didn't sleep. I then started hoping to God that he would protect me. I'm not religious, but the fear of the unknown made me so scared. I was genuinely thinking of getting a cross necklace or something of protection. I think that's when the habit of me knocking on wood started coming full on. There were also subtle things. Things randomly falling over, smells, the list goes on. I remember a bucket fell over. My mom was startled by it deep down, I think. I think she just ignored it because she didn't believe in the paranormal. Another time is when one of my dog's balls rolled on its own. I remember I felt someone tugging on my hair. Nobody was there. Sorry, I told this as a story, but this did happen. I'm being serious. Just how I write. I'm trying not to scare myself or give any unwanted energy. These things do scare me to this day. I forgot to mention. The smell I would smell would be musky. Like an old smell. What do you think? Believers or not? But I sure do know my own experiences. When I was about 11 years old, we went to visit family in Southern California. I was taking a shower, and while I was washing my shampoo out of my hair, I had my eyes closed. All of a sudden I heard a very deep voice saying something above me in a language that I didn't recognize. I thought maybe it was someone just messing with me. I screamed because my eyes were closed, and I couldn't see. I jumped out and got tangled in the shower curtain. I got a towel and ran out. There wasn't even a window in that bathroom, so it wasn't a family member or neighbor. I realized the door was locked from the inside, too. I still can't close my eyes while showering to this day. It traumatized the duck out of me. I believe that house was haunted. Another time, 2 years later, we were visiting at that same house for my cousin's wedding. I was 14 years old. The whole family was sitting in the living room talking and hanging out. There were at least 10 or more people in the general area at that moment. All of a sudden my uncle stares at the coffee table, and we all stop talking and look where he is looking. There was a Coke can dragging slowly across the table. We all stayed there staring at it for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. He says, "F this SHT," and grabs it off the table. We all stare at each other, shocked. My family still lives there. Every year my parents visit, and my mom gets sick. One year I overheard my uncle, it's his house, telling my dad and mom a story. I can't remember if he said it was a dream or a sleep paralysis situation. But anyway, he said he was very sick and was in his room trying to rest. All of a sudden he hears the doorknob rattling and someone trying to get in. He gets up and asks who it is. He hears someone on the other end say, "Hey, it's me, let me in." He said he definitely didn't recognize the voice and said, "Who are you?" It says, "It's me, you know me. Let me in," again and again, getting more and more ducked up in a demonic voice. Nobody believed me, and I don't think anybody ever will. I've had countless paranormal and spiritual experiences as a child, but this one has always stuck with me. 13 years ago, When I was around 6 or 7 years old, my mom, older sister, our little puppy, and I were living in my mom's boyfriend's apartment. The apartment had 3 rooms. The room on the far left was my sister's and mine, the room on the far right belonged to my mom and her boyfriend, and the one room in the middle we called the middle room. We were told not to go into the middle room because it was BF's mom's room. I still remember her. She was very tall and slender, standing at least 6 feet tall. She looked to be in her 70s, with gray, kinky hair. We didn't see her leave the middle room much, but when she did, she would play games with my sister and me. At first, it was fun, and my older sister seemed to love her, but then I would get a dreadful, uncomfortable feeling around her, so I tried to avoid her as much. I think she noticed, because she started treating me differently, pinching me when no one was looking, pulling my hair, and scratching me. Whenever I told my mom, she wouldn't believe me or would brush it off. To be honest, my mom wasn't the greatest parent. Even our little German Shepherd puppy didn't like her. He would bark and growl at her every time she came out of the room. My mom's boyfriend hated the barking and would argue with my mom about it. The fights got so bad that he eventually said either the dog goes, or we all go. My mom gave the dog away. I remember my sister and me crying as we said goodbye to Shiloh. Frown. One day, we didn't see the old lady at all. I asked my sister where she was, and she just shrugged and said, maybe she doesn't feel like playing today, then went back to playing leapfrog. I was happy not to see her that day. That night, everyone went to bed as usual. But I woke up in the middle of the night because I needed to use the bathroom. The bathroom was right in front of the middle room, so I couldn't avoid passing by it. As I walked toward the bathroom, I noticed the door to the middle room was slightly ajar, with light spilling out into the hallway. I got that awful feeling again, but I still wanted to see what was inside. I peeked through the gap in the door, and what I saw will stay with me forever. The old lady was there, but her back was turned to me. She was twitching in a strange, unnatural way, and her skin was gray, like a corpse. She smelled terrible, like rotting flesh. I just stood there, frozen. Suddenly, she turned her head toward me, her eyes completely black. Her face looked gray, like it was decaying. I cried and ran back to my room, diving under the covers and praying she wouldn't come to the door. Thankfully, she didn't. I didn't sleep much that night, but eventually, I dozed off when the sun came. When I woke up, my sister wasn't in the room, so I cautiously walked out, still terrified. I found everyone sitting in the kitchen eating breakfast, but the old lady wasn't there. I ran to my mom and told her everything I had seen. My mom's boyfriend gave her a look, and my mom looked angry and said, "Tierra, fake name, what are you talking about?" I started crying and pointed to her boyfriend and said, "Your mom." My mom popped me on the arm and yelled at me to apologize. I cried and threw a tantrum because they didn't believe me. Every time I explained it all over again, my mom's BF would get madder and madder, and finally he stood up, took me by the arm, and dragged me to the middle room and opened the door. The room was empty. There were old clothes, old jewelry, and old purses that looked to belong to an old lady. The room smelt of dust like no one had been in it for a long time. He dragged me further into the room and pointed to a picture on top of the dresser. In the picture it was the BF's mom, but she looked younger, her hair was black, she had an afro, and she was smiling. He said, "Look here, that's my mom. She died 15 years ago." I was so shocked and scared and started crying even more, so I was sent back to my room and put in timeout. No matter how many times I told the story, no one ever believed me. The nightmares started soon after. Almost every night, I'd dream of her standing at the edge of my bed, laughing at me. Eventually, my mom and her boyfriend had a massive argument and broke up. We moved out and went to live with my grandma. Years later, when I was 11 and my sister was 13, I asked her if she remembered the old lady, our mom's ex-boyfriend's mom. To my surprise, she said she'd never seen an old lady back then. She admitted she only played along because she figured she was my imaginary friend. Still, even now at 19, I know what I saw. And to this day, no one believes me. I think I'm having a paranormal encounter, and no one believes me. I live with my partner and roommate, both of whom are really into paranormal. This is something they bond over. My roommate even has some tools that he has used, even in our own house that is over a century old. I, on the other hand, appreciate it, but I'm not as into it as they are. I'm also more skeptical than they are. Not to say that I don't believe it, because I absolutely do, but I try to look at things from an objective point of view. With that being said, a few months ago, I am pretty sure I encountered a ghost cat. My partner and I have 3 cats. I work from home and have been dubbed the crazy cat lady, so the cats and I are all very attuned to one another. It began with me thinking I saw one of our cats out of the corner of my eye, but when I looked, nothing was there. I then began to see the cat figure walk around out of the corner of my eye. This is when I was introduced to the second ghost cat. One of them looks to be black or dark, while the other looks white. I have never seen both cats at the same time. We have a white cat with gray markings, a brown tabby, and a black and white tuxedo. Sometimes, the ghost cats would do things my cats would normally do, so I chalked it up to being a muscle memory thing. Kind of. I am used to them being there, so I feel like they are there. Until a few weeks ago, I was lying in bed when I thought I saw our white cat with gray spots dart across our room, something she would absolutely do, but when I sat up to talk to her, I didn't see her. I lay back down to see a white cat dart across the room the other way, up into a bedroom window, and I heard scratching/tapping at the window, something my cat would not do. I slowly sat up, thinking it had to be my cat, only to see nothing. I tried telling myself that it's the muscle memory thing, but I couldn't get myself to believe that. I feel like it was a white ghost cat. Because of the number of minor encounters, I decided to bring it up to my partner and roommate. My partner says that he thinks he's seen them too, but he's too afraid to believe it because he feels like it's a bad entity trying to disguise itself as something innocent. I don't believe this whatsoever. My roommate thinks that I'm just too used to cats, and I'm overthinking it. This was super disheartening because I don't feel like I'm being overdramatic. I really believe I can feel them. I knew I had to make this post because not only were their comments eating me up inside, but just a little bit ago, I had a second encounter with one of them, I think a black ghost cat, touching me. I will sit at my desk to work, and oftentimes, my cats will come and rub up on my legs, and then I'll reach down to pet them. A few weeks ago when this happened, and I reached down to feel no cat, I thought it was the chair or my pant leg that just tricked me, but it just happened again. Now I feel fully convinced there is a black ghost cat and a white ghost cat that live in my house. My cats have never acted strangely towards them, which is another reason I don't believe they are evil entities disguised. I also think it could be one ghost cat, but I have absolutely seen both a black and white one, but never together. Thoughts? Am I being dramatic? Is this valid? When I was in the 5th grade, my family moved because our previous house was starting to become too small for us. The house was only 10 years old at the time and in a really nice neighborhood. When we met our neighbors, they would tell us that everyone who lived there only stayed for 2 years and then moved. My family shrugged this off, thinking that the previous owners might have just found new jobs or just didn't like the size of the house. Over the years I had multiple creepy experiences in the house that were always shrugged off by my parents, random phone calls from the house to our phones, things being moved in the morning, even waking up to having my comforter being ripped off my bed. Most of the time I just thought maybe I had moved stuff and forgot about it. However, I would still get moments walking through the house feeling as if I were being watched. Our dog would randomly focus in on an object and follow whatever it was. Creepy, yes, but nothing terrifying. Fast forward a few years, and I was home alone one night with the dog. I took her for a walk around dusk through the neighborhood as I had done hundreds of times. As I was nearing our house, I noticed that a light was on in one of the second-floor windows. This window led into my parents' walk-in closet, so I figured maybe they forgot to turn it off. As I was walking up the driveway, I started to get that feeling of being watched again. When I looked back up to the window, I could now see a silhouette of a person standing by the window. I immediately stopped, and whatever was behind the window flicked the light switch off in the closet. Right after that happened, my dog took off towards the house and started barking at the windows on the first floor, circling the house and barking nonstop. The first thing I did was call every member in my family to make sure that nobody had gotten home while I was gone. After each phone call, I started to become more and more terrified as I learned that each of them was miles away at the time. I explained exactly what I saw to my parents, and my father told me to walk around the house and make sure that all the doors were locked. If one was unlocked, then I needed to call the police. I grabbed a crowbar out of the garage and started circling the house only to find that every first floor door and window was locked. This was the point where I became genuinely scared and didn't want to enter the house for fear that whatever I saw might be there in plain sight now. The point where I started to think about all the small things in the past that had happened and how I had brushed them off as nonsense. After about 15 minutes of standing in the garage with a crowbar, I mustered up the courage to walk into the house. The dog ran in first and immediately started running around the house looking for something. I followed her, making sure that if something popped out, I would be able to hit it as hard as I physically could. The walk up the stairs to my parents' bedroom was the absolute most terrifying walk I've ever had. As I walked up, I noticed my dog was standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring at something over my shoulder. When I finally made it into the room and checked the closet, I found nothing, absolutely nothing. I was almost hoping that I would see whatever it was so I could actually have visual proof. I've never been more freaked out in my life as I sat downstairs waiting for my family to get home. Fast forward to today, and my parents still live in that house. They have had weird things happen only a couple of times over the years but still don't believe that there's something paranormal in the house. My nieces always used to talk about a cat that they would see inside the heat ducts. From time to time, I will house sit but rarely spend the night, and if I do, the TV is on with a light on. Still to this day I feel like something else is in that house. The story was told by a now deceased family friend who was around my mom's age, 20-ish years older than me. Call him Will. We live in a very rural area in Virginia. When Will was about 12, he and some local kids would go into the then undeveloped woods and build forts, dozens of them. That way, wherever they were in town, one was nearby. So he arranged to meet some of the other kids in this one fort after school one day. He ended up being the first one there, so he hunkered down in the hiding spot to wait for the others. So after a while, he hears branches snapping and slow footsteps. He figures it's the other kids and decides it would be funny to jump out and scare whoever it was. However, just as he is about to pop up and yell, he was completely hidden, he notices a flash of white. He looks through the branches and sees a snow-white shirt that is stopped right next to where he was hiding. Knowing it wasn't one of the kids, he peers up and sees a man with a face that he described as. It was the most horrific thing I have ever seen. He said the man just stood there, looking around, and swore he was sniffing the air. Finally, after a few minutes, the man growled or grunted very deeply and then slowly walked off as soon as he was out of sight. Will took off like he never had before or since. When he made it home and told what happened, he was forbidden to go out to those forts again, which he didn't again for a long time. I still remember him telling this story. This story continued to impact him over 40 years later. He said he knew, as in knew, that if that man had found him, he would have been dead. There was no reason a grown man in an oddly spotless shirt would be in the middle of the woods unless Will was followed. When I pressed him about what was so unsettling about the man's face, he just sighed and said, "You had to have seen it," and wouldn't go on. Anyway, I heard this around age 14, and it has always stuck with me. So, when I was around 4, I moved into a house in the middle of a park owned by the city we lived in at the time. The deal was we could live in the house for free, all utilities included, other than cable if we took care of the park. I lived in this house for nearly 9 years, and at first the place was amazing. About 4 years after we moved in, some shit happened. My great-grandmother was diagnosed with colon cancer, very much developed. There was no way she was going to make it, even if they cut out what they could of the cancer. At the time of this, I was in grade 4 and had gotten pretty into ghosts. So, one night, in May, I was sleeping. Around this time, my brother was 3 and had somehow managed to get my parents to sleep on the couches in our living room down the hall. They were always up really late watching TV, so I'd have my bedroom door, which was at the other end of the hall, open so I could see if the TV was on if I woke up. So around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up. The first thing I saw was a little girl lying down in the corner of the bedroom near the closet. She looked to be around 7 or 8, with a white skirt and pigtails. It took me about 2 minutes to register what the duck I was looking at, and it scared the absolute shit out of me. I jumped out of bed and ran down the hall to tell my parents, and as I got to the door, she disappeared. So I went and told my parents, and they just told me I was dreaming or something and to go back to bed, so I did. I fell asleep pretty quickly but woke up not even 20 minutes later, and there she was again. I did the same thing, and she disappeared as soon as I reached the door. After I told my parents it happened again, and they told me to go back to bed again, so I did, and somehow managed to sleep without incident. Then, about a month after that, my great-grandmother passed away from the aforementioned cancer. Fast forward a few weeks after her death. I had gotten into the habit of going into the living room where my parents now slept on an air mattress and sleeping on one of the couches. I'm going to save you the little details because they don't really matter. What does matter is the big shit that happened. While trying to sleep, I was looking down the hall. I could barely see around the corner from the couch, but I could see a little bit. While I was sitting there, I saw something move and look around the corner. It was a short shape, just barely taller than the other couch we had, but I saw it staring at me. And if that wasn't enough, it ducking began walking. It walked over and around the couch and right ducking past me. It was a pure dark shape. No facial features, no clothes, nothing. It was just the shape of a human child, and I swear to ducking God, it looked right at me, and as it walked past the couch I was on, it disappeared. But then more childlike figures began walking past me. At least 10 more are the same after the first one. After the last one, I had had enough. I was scared shitless, so I got off the couch and crawled over to the air mattress my parents slept on and began shaking my dad to wake him up. Whilst doing this, I looked up at the corner to see a figure looking at me from behind it. It was taller than the others, but the key differences were that I could see the outline of curly hair on its head, and I could feel whatever it was staring right the duck into me. I began crying hysterically, and when my dad woke up, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. Since the next day was a Saturday, I was able to think about the figures I'd seen. The last figure with the curly hair actually began to seem familiar, and then I put it together. The figure I had seen had to have been my great-grandmother. It looked exactly like her, from the short, stocky build to the curly hair. As for the kids, it took me a bit longer. If you want to learn about the park, the name is Merkley Park. There's a high school there, right next to the park. Around 1890, it had been an elementary school, which ended up burning down. A few kids did die in the fire. And that's when I realized where the figures came from. Once I moved, the scariest thing that happened to me was that, a few nights after we moved in, I woke up because something had slapped me in the face. No one was in my room when I looked, and I still cannot explain it. My sisters and I have our own paranormal group where we go investigate famous haunted locations around the USA. I've encountered in West Virginia one of the most terrifying but intriguing experiences of my life so far. We were investigating a sanitarium at about 2 a.m. when I saw with my own eyes an 8-foot-tall shadow figure behind my sister and me. He was solid, almost reminded me of Slender Man, and his body distorted and defied physics. He morphed and jumped onto the ceiling and crawled towards us and disappeared. It was one of the most horrifying but intriguing experiences I've ever had so far in this field. It haunts me every night. It was worth it to prove that the paranormal and afterlife exist in my mind. It had such an impact on me that I want to get what I saw tattooed on me. It completely changed my whole outlook on life and the unknown. This was 2 years ago. Since then, we've been to multiple locations to investigate, and we've never come close to what we experienced there. We think it has a lot to do with the land. Native Americans were slaughtered for that land. Locals say they cursed it after that, and the shadow figure is an entity that protects the land and souls that stay. Haunted cabin? So I'm a pretty skeptical person when it comes to the paranormal, albeit having a vested interest in tales and evidence. I'm the kind of person who browses ghost hunter videos. I've also visited plenty of purportedly haunted locations in the US, including but not limited to places like the Omni Parker House in Boston, the Molly Brown House in Denver, the Whaley House in San Diego, Alcatraz at night, and the Winchester House, more than once. None of which have yielded any sort of evidence. A part of me wants to believe but is also terrified at the prospect of witnessing something. I was mostly a non-believer up until a couple of months ago. In short, I had wanted to plan a surprise party and getaway for my girlfriend's 30th birthday. She had mentioned wanting to go hit the slopes. It was January, so it's still wintertime at this point. I organized this months ahead and had invited some of her closest friends to join. I ended up renting an Airbnb cabin that had enough rooms to house 10 people, or 5 couples. One entire lower floor basement level with 2 beds, a room on the first floor, and 3 rooms upstairs. Also adding that this cabin was in a beautiful rural neighborhood in Tahoe, California, with tons of cabins next door, down the street, adjacent, etc., so there's plenty of housing around us. Nothing peculiar about it, and there are other people staying around. Of course, my GF and I take the master bedroom upstairs, and right across the hall is another couple in one room, and my GF's cousin by herself in the 3rd room next door. All rooms are taken, and the middle floor is a lively area with games, a fireplace, and a foosball table. These details are somewhat relevant and important later in my story. The first night was filled with merry drinking and games. To celebrate the occasion, we had decorated the living area and blown up balloons to be loosely strewn around the large and cozy living room and family room where we imbibed. Almost uneventful with respect to weird happenings. Except towards the end of the night, balloons would randomly pop at odd intervals. Someone in our group suggested it was the balloons getting attracted towards the heater vents and popping. I was dismissive of this because not all of them that popped were congregated near vents. Cool. I just took note. Didn't want to argue or suggest anything weird at this point. After we all retired for the night and all the lights were off, we could hear balloons pop downstairs at random intervals that reverberated through the silent house. This happened between 2 o'clock and 3:30 a.m. The next morning, still plenty of healthy balloons were strewn about. Fast forward to night 2, after we returned from snow activities, we prep for drinking and the usual. After a full day's worth of shredding the snow, we are all collectively worn out a bit earlier than the previous night and decide to retire around 11:30 midnight. Here's where I personally experienced things that got me feeling irked. Since it was cold, I decided to go downstairs to turn on the thermostat/heater. Our couple friends across the hall had their door slightly ajar, lights were on, and the bathroom was in use. As I am going downstairs in the dark stairwell, I hear the floorboards behind me creak and figure it is my friend coming out to follow me for a cup of water or to go to the kitchen. As I walk across the living room and stop at the thermostat, the lights are still off at this point, and the creaks continue, and then I hear it stop a few feet behind me near the kitchen. The kitchen lights don't turn on, and I hear nothing else. Feeling like he was waiting behind me and I was being watched, I said, "What's up, dude? Need something?" I turn around, and nobody is there. I've only ever read about this dreadful feeling of being watched, and it is indeed every bit dreadful upon realization in person. A minute ago I swore someone followed me down. I was taken aback, and my skeptical ass once again took note and spoke nothing of it. I go back upstairs. About 30 minutes pass, and it's still cold. At this point, everyone is asleep, and I decide to turn up the thermostat a couple of notches, nothing crazy. I turn on the upstairs hallway light bright enough to light the steps and see from downstairs. I proceeded to head downstairs and stop once again at the thermostat. No floorboard creaks except for my own steps this time. As I was turning up the thermostat and thinking to myself how odd the creaking was the first time, a noise broke my train of thought. I hear the ball from the foosball table several feet away near the fireplace, audibly roll across its surface, and hit one of the side walls. Nobody is around, and I certainly am too far to touch it. I froze in fear and hastily went upstairs back to sleep, not knowing how to mentally process the increasingly evident occurrences. I eventually sleep under the pretense that nothing is definitive enough for me to be conclusively sure that this cabin is haunted. I don't mention or wake anyone up about my experiences. The next morning, as we leave and drive back home, the balloons were brought up by my GF's friend/couple who stayed across the hall. I took this as an opening to talk about my experiences and disclose them. At this point, my GF's friend goes pale, gets serious, and tells us that the previous night she was still wide awake when she noticed a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed. She states that she went into panic mode after blinking and realizing it wasn't a dream or hallucination and shook her boyfriend awake, who I thought followed me down the stairs earlier that night, only to have it disappear. This, by far, coupled with my experiences, is undeniable evidence. I myself was wide-eyed upon hearing this solid piece of information. My GF's cousin, who stayed in the room next to us, then mentioned she heard what sounded like breathing in her room but dismissed it as naturally occurring sounds of the walls in the cabin. These events standalone could be nominal and may be explained, but collectively it's hard to deny that something was present and amiss. I'm hoping this is the extent of my run-ins with the paranormal because I don't want to experience anything like this again. The universe has made me more of a believer. This was many years ago, but it's the first thing that comes to mind. My sister, a friend of ours, and I thought it would be fun to have a sleepover in our treehouse one summer night. We put tons of blankets and pillows down, set up some lights, and ate some snacks, the usual teenage sleepover stuff. Just as we were settling in to go to sleep, we could hear what sounded like someone walking around underneath us. Where the treehouse is located in the back corner of my backyard is mostly dirt and gravel, so we could hear the steps on the rocks and whatnot. One of us whispers, "Do you hear that?" Then bang bang bang. The floor of the treehouse vibrated with each slam against the wood, as if someone found a large stick and was banging it into the bottom of the treehouse. We sat holding our breath for what felt like forever, the whole time listening to whatever it was fumble around, then again 3 to 4 loud pounds, but this time on the other side of the floor. We start ripping up the blankets as quickly and quietly as we could to see if we could make out anyone through the slats of wood underneath. It was dark, but after a little bit we could make out the ground below and the shadow of something circling, but awkwardly and fumbling as if they were drunk or learning to walk. My house is up a hill about half an acre away, and my brother's room faces the backyard, so I text him and explain what's happening and to look out the window. As we're waiting for an answer, the banging continues, all in different areas of the floorboards. Finally, an answer. There's nothing there. What? We can still see this thing beneath us, and there's no way he can't also hear the banging. Moments later I get a picture of the treehouse. My brother is standing in the driveway and cannot see anything underneath. We felt somewhat safer knowing he had eyes on us, but the photo, albeit dark, showed nothing underneath us. We were still too afraid to unlock and open the door, so I called my brother to coerce him into coming down the hill and walking us back to the house. On the phone, he hears the banging. But only through the phone, he cannot hear it in person even though he is now much closer to us. The pounding at this point is relentless and has continued throughout the phone call, up until my brother's foot hits the first rung of the ladder. Everything stops, and the silence almost seems louder than the incessant pounding. My brother walks over the deck to the door, and we let him in, surrounding him with sobbing teenage girls all trying to explain what we heard and saw. We quickly abandoned our blankets and pillows, running up the hill with our arms interlocked to get as far away from that treehouse as possible. Once inside and calmed down, we all recounted our story, and he was his. We, to this day, cannot figure out how we could see and hear that inside the treehouse, but he, standing feet away, saw and heard nothing except what was coming in through the phone. The next morning we went to get our stuff and walk around the backyard, and there were no signs of anyone being there the night before. There was no stick large enough to bang into the floor, the treehouse was too far off the ground for anyone to reach up and slam on it themselves, there were no footprints, and nothing else was visible. We still have no answers to what happened that night, but it was the last time anyone slept in the treehouse. The house is facing the woods. Growing up, after my parents split up, my mother had me move with her half the time to a house that she shared with her other divorced friend and her daughter, who was a few years older than me. I was around 11, and her daughter was about 14. Life was full of turmoil at the time for me as the youngest child, only girl, poverty-stricken, and my mother an alcoholic. This house gave me the creeps from day one of moving in. The thing that always seemed so strange to me was that the house was facing opposite of the road, the only one like that on the entire street. Long dirt driveway that led up to the house, which our main entrance was from the back porch into the kitchen. This was a 3-story home, including the basement, which was completely unfinished except for the washer and dryer that, of course, was hooked up way in the back corner of the entire room. On the first floor was the master bedroom, the only bathroom, a computer room, the door to the basement, and the kitchen/living room area. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms, one my mother and I shared and the other one the daughter stayed in. The master bedroom downstairs was for my mother's friend. Now I was young and alone, always had superstition, so I looked harder into any little thing I thought was a ghost. One thing that triggered me right away was the basement door. It was latched to the wall but loosely. It was constantly being blown open by a draft, as the adults of the house would say. That explanation never sat right with me. I believed in my heart there was a spirit there, letting its presence be known through that door. It would happen at the most random of times and almost purposely when it was just me by myself downstairs nearby. This alone had me become very imaginative about what was going on. I would create stories in my mind of what could be. I knew I was taking these slight paranormal experiences and running with them in my mind, but there were a few things that truly made me feel it was all so real. I was going to school and telling my friends ghost stories about the house as a way to garner attention and almost cope with the situation. I was pretty much lying about 98% of everything I said. But the truth is this. The basement door was opening on its own. The daughter of my mother's friend didn't believe what I had to say at first until one day after high school. She got home before anyone else, she went to shower, and after finishing in the shower, while home alone, the locked doorknob to the bathroom shook rapidly as if someone tried to force their way in. This bathroom door was on the opposite side of the basement door in the same hallway. She believed me from that moment on. Her friend came over once and claimed to be a psychic medium, and he said that he saw a tall, dark figure walk out of the hallway into the kitchen as well. Besides all that, it was the night you could say I got what I asked for. Clear, cold, hard proof that I was living in a haunted house. I've told this story to anyone that ever cared to listen and have been met with so many different reactions. People have flat out said they don't believe me because of how crazy it sounds. So here's what happened. I was in the computer room downstairs, it was around 9 p.m., and I was using the house phone to talk to my friend from school about whatever we were doing on the computer together. The adults weren't home, just me downstairs, and upstairs was my mother's friend's daughter taking a weed nap. No joke, she was a stoner. The door to the computer room was open and had a clear view down the hall to the basement door, which was a bit too close for comfort. As I'm on the phone, the basement door creaks open. I immediately got scared and decided to go upstairs as quick as possible. My friend on the phone knew about the situation, but being the bold kids we were, she encouraged me to go back downstairs after a few minutes of being upstairs bored without the computer. I agreed to be ballsy and head back downstairs, except my approach is what I believe warranted what happened next. I hung up the phone with my friend and started to go back downstairs, confronting the spirit that I felt was harassing me and personally targeting me. At the time, "What Do You Want From Me" by Adam Lambert was big on the radio, so I sang the line, "What do you want from me?" Going down the stairs. I take it even further and start acting confrontational towards the spirit, saying, "F you, ghost, you can't do shit to me," and sticking my middle finger up at the basement door. I know it's super cringe and embarrassing to even remember. While I was doing this, I walked around to the kitchen. My back is to the front, back, door. Keep in mind it's like 9 p.m. at night. The doorbell rings at this exact moment. I'm expecting it to be either my mother or her friend getting home after the long day. Super embarrassed that I just got caught talking to nothing, I turn around and pull the sheer curtain to the side to see who's standing at the door. Nobody. This doorbell speaker system is hooked up in the hallway of the basement door. Unfortunately for me, this isn't just the regular ding-dong traditional doorbell. For some odd reason, we had the super extra doorbell system that played a different song every time you rang it. For example, Jingle Bells or something else short and sweet. So by the time the doorbell chime completes and I see there's nobody at the door, I've fully processed what's going on. And yet it gets worse. After the first bell chime finishes, I swear to everything in my life and all that I cherish, a voice comes out of the speaker system. A feminine voice. One that is speaking gibberish to my ears. And then the doorbell rings again. I ran up the stairs so damn fast, I'm screaming the daughter's name to wake her up and banging on her door so she can wake up and come unlock it to let me in. By the time she does and I come inside, she's like, "What's going on?" I told her, "Shh, shh, shh," and she got to hear the final doorbell chime. I explained to her what happened, and she just sat there in shock. A few other incidents occurred during my time there, but nothing as clear and terrifying as that night. A few months later, my mother and her friend had a huge fight, and we moved out. I believe that spirit in that house targeted me and fed off the negativity in my life. I've spoken to a few psychics since becoming an adult, and one psychic in particular brought up this spirit and said she followed me. I believe it may be true. I have a recurring dream of a girl locked in a basement, my spirit begging me to save her. Not to leave her. I could never forget my experience in that house, and especially not that night. That time I witnessed a blue ghost boy and cried like a baby. When I was around 13-14, I witnessed something that to this day I cannot understand. Around this time I was going to karate classes every Wednesday, and after said lesson I would go back to a family friend's house with my parents for a catch-up as their son went to the same class. This particular evening was as normal as any other. I went to the class, got picked up, and we went to the family friend's house. Nothing out of the ordinary. We got to their house, went inside, and sat down at their table in the kitchen. Now when we enter the house, we go in through the back entrance into the kitchen, and on the opposite side of the kitchen, directly across from the back door, was the doorway into the living room, and right between these two doorways was the table, just a little off to the right of the back door. When we got there and I sat down, the position I'd say I was in was on the back side of the table, so I was facing the doorway to the living room, a little off center so I could just see into a small part of the room. Now, when I sat down, I was completely fine. We were all chatting, having a cuppa as we Brits do, discussing the upcoming grading we have in the future to move up belt colors. Until for some reason everything seemed to slowly mute around me, the sounds of talking slowly quieting, almost as if someone had a TV remote and was lowering the volume of the room, and whilst this was happening, something was drawing my attention to the living room. However, seeing as I was offset from the doorway, I couldn't see into it properly, so I shifted my weight and leaned to the left a little so I could see through into the room, and when I did, it was like time froze and the moment lasted an eternity. Sitting on the floor in the center of the living room was a child. Not too creepy, eh? Until my brain clicked, and I took what I was seeing in. The child was a young boy, I'd say around 8 to 10 years old, but not of this era. This was around 2004, and not a drop of gel or baggy jeans to be seen on this boy. He was dressed, as best as I can describe, like a Victorian chimney sweep. He was wearing a waistcoat, a shabby shirt, ratty pants, and a flat cap. At this point I couldn't see his feet because he was sitting cross-legged, just staring at the wall. He was sat sideways so I could only see him from his profile. Think Oliver Twist, and you've got what I was seeing. The main thing that was otherworldly, abstract, and confusing was the fact that he was blue. The best way to describe this blue would be the ghost forms that dead Jedi take on when they die. However, the standout difference was that he was solid. I couldn't see through him, none of that stuff that usually goes with ghosts. It was like his flesh was literally made that way. Once my brain connected with my eyes and decided that yep, this isn't right, my heart started up and was beating so fast I thought it was going to burst through my chest. As my heart decided to break dance in my chest cavity, the whole thing went right past 10 and all the way up to 20 on my what the duckety meter as he decided to turn his head and look me dead in the eye. Pun intended. It was like he saw straight past my flesh and bone and right into my soul, and my body froze. I felt as cold as his icy person looked. This wasn't a quick snap of his head either, he turned his head with slow, disturbed meaning. Once he made eye contact and I had frozen from soul to bone, he turned his head in the same manner back to the wall he was first staring at. Now this next part is what creeps the shit out of me. He stands up. But not in a way I can describe properly. It's almost like 1 second he was sitting, and the next he was standing. I can't exactly describe the movement, but it was like he skipped the actual standing from sitting part to just straight up standing in the middle of the room. I'm sat there staring into the room, the moment lasting for what seemed an age, watching this glowing blue urchin from well over a century ago go from sitting squat on the floor to standing. And then he moves. Not a floaty, ooh, I'm a ghost, and I'm going to float away move, but he swings leg after leg and walks straight on, and through, mind you, through their electric fireplace, and just like that he's gone. As soon as he passes through the fireplace and leaves, all sound rushes back all at once, to the point that it's a deafening wave. When the sound hits me, so does a wave of emotion. Not fear, but pure, unadulterated sadness and loneliness. You know how people match the color blue with sadness? Like that, like this small child was made of nothing but just that. And it hit me like a ton of bricks to the chest. The next thing I know, I'm standing bolt upright and staring into the room, yet my limbs feel like lead, and my chest is pounding while feeling like a weight is on it. And I cry. I cry like nothing before. Picture cartoons where characters cry and jets of tears spring from their eyes like streams from a hose, and all I feel is sadness, grief, and loneliness. And everyone else around the table freaks the feck out. As my sadness slowly ebbs away, I kind of come round and stare my mum down, tears streaming down my face, and start blubbering between gasps and cries about what I'd just experienced. The confusion on her face said it all. I was the only one who experienced it, and I felt like I'd gone nuts. The friends whose house we were in said absolutely nothing. They all consoled me, saying I was maybe tired or something, but I know what I saw, and it, ironically, still haunts me to this day. So my question is, am I mad, or has anyone experienced anything else like this? I have had many paranormal experiences in my life, have had a couple of shadow people experiences, worked at a very haunted assisted living facility, and grew up in what I would describe as a haunted house. One of the scariest encounters was a shadow person experience I had when I was around 11 or 12 years old. One evening my parental figure reminded me I'd left my band instrument in her car that was parked on the street in front of her house and I needed to practice that night. It was not completely dark yet, and the trip to the car and back takes maybe a minute. I walked outside with my eyes set on the car when something to my right caught my attention. My house was next to an empty lot, which was next to our neighbor's house. They had a row of a handful of very tall pine trees along the sidewalk that stretches from the road to their front door. Above that door was a light that was turned on and illuminating a bit of the area. The thing that caught my attention was a figure. Honestly, I don't remember if I felt the presence first or saw it first, but it happened really quick. The figure was between two of the trees. He looked male and fairly large but was completely black. The light that shone behind him did nothing to illuminate him. I should have been able to see some detail of his clothes or face or something, but he was pitch black. The thing that made my hackles stand on end was how he was standing. He looked almost puffed out, like, think of a burly man trying to look intimidating. To me, it had looked as though he had been about to charge at me. Again, this all happened within seconds, but I'll never forget it. I remember running back inside freaking out and immediately locked the door and told my parental figures. There are more pieces to this encounter. My first ever shadow person encounter also happened to be around the very same kind of trees when I was much younger. Not sure if there's a correlation there, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Another dark aspect of all of this is regarding that specific neighbor's house. There seems to be a string of bad happenings throughout the years at that house. I'm fuzzy on the really old details, but I do know many years ago a previous owner died in the house. About 15 to 20 years ago, a woman and her partner lived there. The woman was killed, along with others, one night in a drunk driving accident. A few years after that tragedy, that woman's partner was dating a different woman. They were drinkers, and one night that woman fell down the stairs and died. I remember the ambulance that came to assist, but it was too late. I have many stories, but again, I'll never forget this experience. The very primal fear I felt was intense and automatic when I realized I was looking at something that didn't want to be seen. I grew up in what you could consider a haunted house. It was brand new when we moved in during the 90s, but it was in a country area where there had been battles and likely Native Americans. Being in a haunted house didn't mean things would happen every day, but there would be some strange incidents. Most of the time it was targeted toward my mom, I think because she was the most receptive to it. She was more intrigued and almost excited about it. My dad would brush it off that there was nothing happening. Most of the stuff toward the beginning was mild. You would turn up the TV's volume, but it would stutter to mute when you did so. My mom was holding the only selector in her hand, watching as the TV was fighting with her for the volume. There would be a feeling of something heavy jumping on the bed at night. Footstep sounds. Stuff like that. It seemed like over time, as we lived there for a period of 19 years, it would get more violent. My mom had a lot of the more violent occurrences, choking at night, item flinging across the room, and she saw a full apparition of a very skinny, long, blonde-haired girl in a white nightgown running full speed down the stairs and dipping off to the hallway. Since that sort of describes my sister, she went to investigate, thinking something was wrong, but found no one there, and my sister was in bed sleeping. My mom got curious and decided to get an Ouija board out. She bought this Ouija board off eBay. It was some used antiques. I was in my teens at the time, and I was like, oh hell nah, leave that be. I refused to play, as did everyone in the house, so she was playing alone. I actually thought she was going insane for this period because she was getting obsessed with it like it possessed her. It is so bizarre to think about it now, but it was like she was taking this Ouija board in the car to dinner. She would need it with her everywhere she went. Carried it to the toilet even. She said it was saying mama. She started acting all-knowing and suspicious toward people and saying, I know what you did, in an accusatory tone. It was so weird, I thought she 100% was just losing it and maybe not even paranormal. But maybe like a month or so of this, everyone was fed up with her and thinking she was going crazy, something scared her. I don't know what it was. One day she was like, I'm not playing it anymore. I have no idea what it said or what happened, but she was convinced it was a demon, and she had only said that it started to change into nasty speaking. We were convinced that the apparition of the little girl was merely a demon-like creature, designed to appear non-threatening and pique my mom's curiosity, given her love for children and her role as a mother. After that, the house appeared to have undergone a significant decline in activity. Doors started slamming at night. All night. We would just say it's like the air is circulating badly. My sister and I were upstairs in the shared bedroom, and we were just chatting on the bed. We heard what sounded like someone taking a hammer to the wall late at night, maybe 4 or 5 loud bangs from downstairs. It was not that uncommon for my mom to be doing some DIY project even late at night because she had sort of a disordered sleep schedule and would be up all hours at times. The next morning, my mom goes, "What the heck were you doing last night?" And we looked at her like, "Huh? That wasn't you?" She said it not only was banging but scraping like someone was taking a chair and scraping it over her ceiling. All I heard were bangs. We both thought it was from different areas of the house. My sister had been in bed asleep when the door was creaking loudly back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Her initial thought was wind and that the window was open. She remembered she closed it the night before and sat bolt upright, looking at the door just moving by itself back and forth, back and forth. She yelled, "Go away, ghost." And it stopped. So what happened to me personally? I didn't have so many personal experiences because I was very unreceptive and didn't want ghosts. Also, I kind of just thought maybe they were not real, like maybe my mom was too imaginative, a kind of continuous denial, lol. But during this time it seemed like it got more powerful and less dormant. It was late at night, the entire family was upstairs watching a movie in what we transformed into a movie room. We were going to watch another film, so I got up and went downstairs to the kitchen to get some orange juice. I walked past the hallway, the same one that the girl vanished down, and honestly, even as a child, that hallway freaked me out a little. I'm not sure why, it was kind of like The Shining, where you look at it and just feel like you're being watched or, more aptly, stalked, because it feels like a violent intention to the watching feeling, so I never liked it. But I'm not thinking much aside from getting orange juice. I put the orange juice carton on the counter, getting a glass. About 3 to 4 feet away from me at the end of the counter was the trash bin. My mom had hung up this heavy bead curtain kind of to disguise the bin being there, I guess. This bead curtain was heavy, though, like it had some weight to it. I'm pouring orange juice, and this bead curtain swings out like someone slapped it really hard, like they punched it. I'm just staring at this curtain and watching it swing. Feeling a bit freaked out and can't think or see a logical reason this would happen. Nothing fell on it or anything. I'm not sure if I imagined this or not because I was now freaked out, but I could have sworn I saw a dark black shadow person dart off in the corner of my eye to that cursed hallway area. I just collected my orange juice and walked upstairs calmly but quickly. We ended up going to a Catholic priest, Lamau. I know it sounds like a fictional story. Even now I'm thinking about it, and getting some advice about the Ouija board. He was a bit freaked out, seeing as we told him the events. My mom shared her more violent events that occurred. He gave us the advice to cut the board up into 7 pieces and burn it away from the house, and he offered us holy water. We ended up getting the cooker out in the backyard. My dad was like, "Okay, let's cook the thing." He was tired of my mom being obsessed with it, and so we cut it up into 7 pieces and burned it. As soon as we burned it, embers rose, and snow started falling. This wasn't a usual part of the area to get snow and was rare to see, so it was a very strange coincidence, or maybe it was connected, I have no idea. The activity died down for a while but then seemed to return with my mom hearing someone calling her name, and my dad finally saw his first shadow person ghost after all the years he denied it was haunted. But yeah. We moved shortly after. We live in a house now that I wouldn't consider haunted at all. There have been maybe 1 to 3 instances since I moved here in 2013, but I refuse to believe there's a ghost here, and even if there is, it's nowhere near as much activity as that old house. My scariest experience. Prologue, I don't talk about this much. It's been many years since it happened. This experience haunts my dreams. I spent a year in county jail. My time was spent on lockdown. I could never pay attention to the exact time of day/night since the block clock was never maintained. I do know it was the quiet hours of the early morning before sunrise. Multiple days I would see shadows and reflections through my window into the great room. I would regularly see silhouettes walk past my window, and I would often dismiss them as guards taking rounds checking on us inmates to ensure we were still present. There would be times, however, that my curiosity would get piqued when I saw a passing shadow, but I never heard any doors open or close from the guards in the bullpen. I would climb out of my bunk and try to look left and right out of my door's window, but I never saw a guard returning to his post. After weeks of seeing this same phenomenon, I finally saw something that sent shivers down my spine. One night while reading a book, I couldn't shake this feeling of being watched. I was used to the passing shadows by this point, but as I mentioned, they were always passing. This was something else. I don't remember ever seeing it appear or leave. It was as I can only describe as omnipresent. It felt as though it had always been present. Just waiting. Watching. Only this time it allowed me to observe it. Almost like it materialized. There were no shapes, no discernible edges. There was only a void. A black hole as deep as space itself. And in the middle were 2 piercing red eyes. I could never steel myself enough to make direct contact. I didn't need to know it was there. I could feel its gaze in my peripherals. I was prey, and it had been stalking me, and both of us were just waiting for the other to make the first move. All I could do was to pretend I didn't notice it, hoping that it would lose interest. At some point, not knowing how much time had passed, I eventually fell asleep. It only appeared the one time. The only person I have shared that story with is my partner, but never in as much detail. I thank you all for taking the time to listen to this and creating a safe place where someone can feel comfortable sharing their deepest fears. Star Hill Hauntings. In a small town in upstate New York, about 15 minutes north of Utica, there is a place called Remsen that is home to quite the hot spot for unexplained activity. Star Hill, as it's known locally, is a point on Star Hill Road in Remsen, New York, where the Penn Mountain State Forest meets the road. On the road are 2 parking areas, both with impressive views of the Mohawk Valley. You'll find 2 lookouts, one along the actual road and another off of a trail that turns off the road and goes into the forest. Locally, we refer to them as the first and second lookouts, first being the one by the road, second being the one in the forest, so I will be referring to them as such. Up this trail is also a cemetery, a small cluster of buildings, if you can call them that, a small body of water known as Hatch's Pond, and a radar dome with a sign from the U.S. Air Force prohibiting anyone from getting too close to it. All of these locations have their share of strange activity. Over the years, people have mostly used this as a gathering spot. It isn't uncommon to go up there on a nice weekend in the summer and find people camping or some high school kids having a party. That is, or at least was, mostly what it's known for, high school parties. I've spent my fair share of time here over the years and have only experienced one of these myself. It's just the kind of place everyone seems to have a story about. Stories vary from hearing screams in the middle of the night to floating orbs of light crossing the road and disappearing into the woods. I will outline all of these phenomena and provide some possible explanations. The orbs, undoubtedly, the most popular story is that of the mysterious floating orbs that can be seen alongside the road by the first lookout. Everyone's story seems to be the same. 2 to 3 orbs of light floating about 6 feet above the road appear seemingly out of nowhere. They appear to almost dance around and slowly move across the road before disappearing into the trees. I have personally seen them while I was parked at the first lookout, facing down the road. I saw 2 of these orbs float slowly across the road, then seemingly disappear into the tree line, just like the stories had said. What could be causing this? The legends say these are the lanterns of a Daniel Roberts, a 19th century doctor who lived in the area and practiced holistic medicines and herbal remedies. Locals called him the witch doctor and claimed he also showed interest in the occult. In 1820, A roadside accident threw him off his horse. The fall broke his leg, and he died at the age of 45 from his injuries. He often traveled at night with a lantern and hung one from a window in his house. People say his spirit is carrying these orbs as if they are lanterns, while he still travels that same path he did so many years ago. Another popular story is that the lanterns are carried by Baron von Steuben, a Revolutionary War general who once lived in the area. Sometime after his death in the early 1900s, they moved his body from its original resting place to a memorial that had been constructed in his honor. His final wishes were strictly against this, as he wanted a burial that a normal man would receive. Legend states that these lanterns are carried by the Baron, searching for his body. One thing is certain, these lights cannot be coming from a vehicle. They are too far apart to be headlights and have a distinct flicker to them, like candlelight. It has often been speculated that they are being produced by a car driving through the area. However, they do not produce light in the same way that a vehicle's headlights would. There are no other roads in the direction that you'd be able to see. The screams, another popular occurrence people often report is hearing blood-curdling screams all throughout Penn Mountain Forest. Centered mostly around the cemetery, people say that the screams of a woman can be heard at random hours of the night. They have been reported in other areas, but mostly near the cemetery. The theory explaining this is that back in the 60s and 70s, a man by the name of Bernard Barney Hatch, who lived nearby, would kidnap women from the surrounding areas of New Hartford and Utica. He would bring them into the woods and kill, torture, or bury them there. They were only ever able to pin one crime on him, and that was the murder of Mary Rose Turner. On April 26, 1973, Hatch ended her with his car. He then buried her body in the woods alongside the road at an intersection. He is currently serving a life sentence in state prison, but many believe he is responsible for other unsolved murders of women and children in the area during that time. The screams are said to be that of his many victims, who never got the justice they deserved. The rocking chair. Drive up the rocky dirt path, and you'll stumble upon a cemetery. This cemetery dates back to the late 1800s and has a ton of graves from this time period. There was once a rocking chair here, and it has been said that anyone who sat in it would die within the next 24 hours. Today, it is no longer there. The story goes that a young lady had gone there with a group of friends, and some of them had dared her to sit in the chair. Knowing the legend and dismissing it, she sat in it anyway. That girl lost her life in a car accident the following day. The father, after talking with one of the grief-stricken friends, had learned about the dare and legend. He went up to the cemetery and destroyed the chair so no other parents would lose their children to it. Evidence of this is scarce and almost non-existent. However, many do report that there was in fact a rocking chair there at one point, and it has gone missing. No one seems to know what happened to it. There are also signs posted around the cemetery saying that there are security cameras in use, 2 of which can be seen mounted on trees. They seem to be pointed in the corner where the chair supposedly was. It could be argued that they were put in place to deter vandalism, which unfortunately seems commonplace there. That, however, does not explain why they would be focused on that corner in particular. Miscellaneous occurrences. These events are not popularly reported or experienced by a great number of people that visit here, but a few people have shared these stories with me and others, so I believe they deserve to be listed here in some fashion. Hatch's Pond, nicknamed after Barney Hatch, has had numerous legends surrounding it. Stories of it being used at some point by the Mafia, which had a large presence in Utica for years, for alleged body dumping are plentiful. However, no evidence to support this has ever come up. According to some, the whole forest was used at one point or another by the Mafia for various reasons, since it was remote and far away from the city. Only one story of a local tow truck company pulling a car out of a pond could possibly have a connection to this. However, no evidence of human remains was found in it, and it was deemed most likely that someone had stolen the car from a dealership and dumped it here. This is somewhat supported by the fact that it was a relatively expensive vehicle at the time, and it reportedly had extremely low miles. No evidence of it being used for a body dump ever surfaced. There is a small collection of structures near the pond, dubbed the Hermit's Village. Many people have claimed that a hermit had once lived in these small structures and would be aggressive towards people traveling by. There is no recent evidence of a person living there, and it most likely was used as a sort of hunting area back in the day. Basements of long-forgotten structures can also be found in the surrounding area. Reports of lights following you up the trail also pop up from time to time. A friend told me that lights appear behind you, only for no vehicle to pass by. There are only a few places to turn off, mostly towards the beginning of it, so a vehicle turning onto another offshoot of the trail is unlikely. People have also reported speaking to a man in a military uniform, thought to be the ghost of the Baron, who was buried in his. I've also been told of a man in an old white pickup truck, offering to give you a ride to the party that's happening further up the trail. When you make your way up the trail, you don't find a single soul, let alone a party, and the truck seems to have disappeared. Also, sprinkled throughout the state forest, there are concrete structures, with no clues as to what they once were. Most likely they are basements or foundations of some type. There was originally a Welsh settlement in the area, which would explain why they might be there. There is plenty of what appears to be more modern construction as well, and it's anyone's best guess as to what they are. These are just a small collection of some of the things that happen up here. If you're from the area and have your own stories, please feel free to share them. If you've never been before and are willing to take a drive there, you won't be disappointed if ghost hunting is your type of thing. I stayed in a haunted house for 5 months, and it changed my life. In January to May of 2022, my mom and I had to move out of our house due to my father's passing away unexpectedly at home. A friend of my mom's, whose mom also just passed away and who used to live in the house as well, was kind enough to offer that we live there until we could find a different house / back on our feet. We had stayed at this house before to watch her dogs for shorter periods of time, like for a week while they went on vacation. Every time we would stay over, she would say, "Let me know if the spirits do anything while we're away, and I'll get on to them. But just politely tell them to stop. Don't be rude." And that's what we did. We would hear noises around the house, see figures outside, see shadows down the hallway, and we would tell them to stop, and it would stop for a few hours or so. When we first settled into the new house after fully moving in, everything was as fine as it could be after that terrifying experience of my dad passing in front of us. But I do remember on the first night I was on a call with my boyfriend because I couldn't sleep, and I remember hearing things that made me terrified. My boyfriend does not believe in the paranormal, so he would always say, "It's just the house settling." But I knew it wasn't. During my time in this house, I experienced the following events. I had an old cabinet that the homeowner's mother, who just died as well, used to own in my room. I had clothes and my skincare inside, so I would use it daily. It was hard to close, and we had to essentially clamp it shut or else the door would swing out by itself. So, like every morning, I specifically remember clamping it. But when I got home, the doors were both fully open, and one of my sweaters looked like it had been thrown on the floor. The scariest thing was that my mom had arrived home maybe 25 minutes before I did, and she said the cabinet was closed. So this happened in the time span of 25 minutes. Sometimes I would get home very late after being at my boyfriend's house until 9, 10, or 11 p.m. I would get ready for bed, take a shower, and get a water from the kitchen. Where my room was located, you had to walk past the front door, which is fully glass. I would always see figures in the yard or on the porch, walking around. It always terrified me. The homeowner's mother, who died, absolutely loved one of the dogs. Her name is Lady. Whenever she wanted Lady around, she would always call out her name in a very specific and memorable way. One day it was just my sister and me in the house. I was in the kitchen and she was in the guest bedroom by my room. I heard what sounded exactly like the mom yelling for Lady. It was loud. I run to my sister's room. "Did you call for Lady?" I asked her. "No, why would I? She's lying on her bed right here." She pointed at the floor on the far side of the bed, and sure enough, there she was. The final experience I will be talking about, definitely not the last I've experienced, is the biggest one for me. And it's happened to me twice. Everyone was there that evening. The homeowner and her husband, my mom, my sister, my boyfriend, and I were all in the house. We were having a big dinner, I can't remember what. I went into the kitchen to go get a drink, and my sister said she was going to do the same, so I figured she was right behind me. I'm standing, facing away from the entrance, and I felt someone touch my shoulder, not too firm but not gentle either. I say, "What?" and turn around, only to see my sister just then walking into the kitchen. My mouth dropped. I asked, "Did you just touch my shoulder?" She looked at me like I was crazy. I just walked in. I started to freak out. Someone just touched my shoulder. People ran into the kitchen to calm me down. The homeowner looked at me in shock and said, "No one has ever been touched by the spirits in this house. Maybe my daughter was years ago when she was very little, they would always mess with her. But I'm still not sure she was actually touched. It's safe to say I never entered that kitchen alone ever again." So, yeah. There you have it, some of the best experiences I've had at that house. The last experience has forever changed my life. I think about it daily. For context, the house is 100 plus years old. The homeowner grew up in that house, and her father passed in the living room. Her mother lived with her up until a couple of days before she passed. She died in hospice. My mom and I had moved in right after witnessing my dad pass at our house. He very well could have followed us there, and the area of Virginia we lived in was surrounded by battlefields. Thank you for listening. Is my daughter seeing something? My 3-year-old daughter is finally reaching a point where we can understand most of what she says. We recently bought a house and finished moving in. It's a nice, quiet neighborhood, located outside of our next-door neighbor, Karen. My sister and my wife said that they heard my daughter talking with someone in her room. They heard someone responding to her as well. Upon investigating, there was nobody there. I told them they must have been hearing things, and she was just playing and practicing her speech. 2 days later, I had my first ever case of sleep paralysis. It was about 3 a.m., and I was drifting off to sleep. Shortly before or just after I fell asleep, I locked up and felt like I was being laid on. I heard a creepy exhale in my left ear that was really quiet at first and got really loud. I broke myself out of it by screaming babe. But I guess I didn't scream because my wife was still asleep. I've never had that happen even in houses that were confirmed to be haunted. The following morning, I walked to my daughter's room because I'm sure it was the same thing she'd been talking to because the presence was definitely an angry female. I started speaking so as to address the thing. I said that this is my house now and that they aren't welcome. I said that I will not be held down in my own bed, and it will not terrify my daughter or talk to her at all. I said that I'm giving it the option to leave on its own or I would be calling a priest. This was mainly to give respect to it since it was human at one point, and I wanted to give it that human option. After I finished speaking, the air felt lighter, and nothing happened for a good while. Fast forward 5 months later to tonight, my daughter has been inconsolably crying in her new room. We moved her across the house. I had been checking on her every hour, and making sure she had what she needed, but nothing was working. My wife came in the room and started talking to her, and she uttered out that she was scared. When we asked what of, she pointed to the upper corner of her room above her bed and said, "She's so up there." We said, "Who is she?" Without an answer. I told her to come to me, face the corner she was pointing at, and tell it to go away. She happily did and turned back to me. I was chatting with my wife about it, and she turned around and said, "Where did she go?" So I repeated the question she asked me, and she looked around and said, "She's right there," pointing on the ceiling in between the two corners, now directly above her bed. I spoke to what I believe now is someone who might be attached to the house, saying, "I thought we fixed this issue, but I guess I'm going to have to call the priest since you don't want to leave." I told my daughter that if she sees her again, to say go away. We left her bedroom light on and gave her some milk, and that seemed to have done the trick to get her to sleep. Does anyone have any advice on what this could be? How would I go about explaining this to a priest? Does this even require a priest? There are many unanswered questions, but something is scaring my daughter, and I want it to stop. A witness to an unexpected reaction to a haunted place. About a couple of years before the 2020 lockdowns, my wife used to have a weird work schedule where she worked most Saturdays, so our weekends were kind of split. So whenever there was a Saturday or Sunday where I was home alone with our son, who was about 7 at the time this event happened, I used to take him on little adventures. One time we found a book that was made by a historical society to promote kids visiting little-known museums in our state. This book had a lot of places I have never even heard of, and I have lived here my entire life. I am also an older dad. On average, I am about 8 to 10 years older than most dads in my son's age range. I only mention that because I am not really one of those dads who will do a lot of theme parks and that kind of stuff. I actually don't like crowds or waiting in line, and I attribute that to me being an old dad. I do love history, so when we got that book about the little-known museums in the state, we set out to try and visit nearly every one. My son always loved our adventures together because we would say it was a boys' day out. I guess that was to make him feel okay that mommy wasn't joining us. One day we picked a museum that had to do with a family who settled the area and became wealthy due to oil but also suffered lots of deaths and hardships. That morning I made us breakfast, and then we put on comfortable clothing and shoes and packed some snacks for the road. We arrived at the museum, and to be honest, it wasn't at all what I was expecting. The area was surrounded by massive complexes of industrial buildings, but hidden way back was this pretty big tract of open land that had a museum, a gift shop, a cemetery, a bunch of older buildings, and the grand house. We paid the donation for the house and grounds tour, and it had a bunch of old farm equipment and the kind of typical museum objects that were all from shortly after the Civil War to the turn of the century, the 1800s, 1900s. We were in a group of all adults, and my son was the only kid on the tour. Most of the people were actually older than me. There was a group of Asian families, not sure where they were from, but they didn't speak English, but they all seemed really nice and enjoyed seeing the Old West stuff. There was another family who looked like siblings and a mom, an older middle-aged couple, and a few single people in our tour. Everything was going fine, no issues as we were doing the grounds tour, talking about old farm life and ranch life. The tour guide was talking about all the cattle and how the original deed had land going all the way out past the freeway and almost out towards the next county over, so the original family land was very vast and probably very lonely to the original settling family. As soon as we entered the main house, one of the ladies who was with us started acting like she was having a fit. She looked really normal, about in her mid-40s. If I had to describe her, I would say she looked PTA president. From what I remembered, she stayed back by the entry door and did her best not to make a scene. When we moved from that entryway to the main parlor, she seemed like she was starting to cry in a silent whimper, and then she started shaking. She didn't appear to be experiencing a medical emergency, but rather, it appeared as though she had recently learned of someone's death. Her expression fluctuated between extreme sadness and fear, accompanied by trembling and paleness. Eventually, a woman asked, "Are you okay?" And she blurted out, "I need to get out of here." The tour guide stopped the tour and said, "Ma'am, I can't let you out alone, nor can I leave the tour alone, so everyone in the tour is going to have to follow me to let you out." We all were like, "Yeah, of course." Everyone had concern for her. As we left the house and made our way to the parking lot and to the locked gate, I noticed her color came back, and she started looking better. She exited the gate, and just right outside, there was a bench, and she sat there and started to cry. Our tour guide went to check on her and asked if she needed them to call 911. She said no, but she didn't know what came over her, and she had never had a reaction like that before. The tour guide had actually said, "Well, you're not the first one to have a reaction to the house, but please check in with the museum if you need water or if you want to sit inside for a bit," the lady said. "No, I'm fine, I'm going to go home." When the tour guide returned to the gates, she apologized to us for not allowing us to stay in the house alone. As she was speaking, I noticed a woman get up from the bench and quickly walk back to her car, almost as if it was midnight and she was in a dark parking lot. Eventually we all returned to the house and went into the parlor. It was a formal sitting area with old 1800s furniture and a pistol in a case over the mantel. One of the guys on the tour had asked the question that I am sure was in all our minds. "What did you mean when you said that she wasn't the first one to have a reaction inside the house?" That is when the tour took a dark side. Apparently, back in the late 1800s, the owner of the land, who had inherited the land and stock from his father, almost lost everything due to bad deals, bad management, and loss of cattle. One evening there was a knock at the door we had entered. It was bankers, a judge, and a sheriff or something like that. Well, they had come to call the outstanding loans, and of course he didn't have the money to pay it back, so he had to deed large tracts of his family land over to the banks to repay the loans. Shortly after midnight the gentleman left and rode out. Suddenly there was a shot heard, and the landowner had sat in the very chair in the parlor and put the very gun that hung over the mantel to his head and ended himself. His body was laid to rest in the family cemetery just outside the main house and adjacent to the parking lot. The tour guide also said that about a decade later, when the landowner's son took over the family land, oil was discovered on the property, mostly on the property that still belonged to the family, so they went from almost losing the family land to later generations becoming very wealthy again. She also mentioned that during Halloween they do ghost tours and then stopped talking about the house being haunted. I think mostly due to the fact that my son was with us. However, he wasn't paying attention and was busy looking at other things. At almost the end of the tour, just as we were outside the house and around the back, my son looked over at the house and pointed to the window and said, "What's that?" I looked, and so did everyone else. Nothing was in the window. I asked him, "What did you see?" And he just walked away. He freaked everyone out, and we all went back to the parking lot, and my son and I went to the gift shop. I tried to ask him again what he saw, and he just said, "I think it was a pet." I didn't want to freak him out, so we just bought some old-time candy and went home. I didn't know anything about the house or grounds prior to the visit and didn't know it was supposed to be haunted. The situation took place in my village, where I was born, in eastern Poland. For a long time, the front of World War II passed through the forests near my house, and the battles here lasted quite a while. The entire area is still littered with helmets, soldier equipment parts, and smaller souvenirs. As a child, I had about 20 German helmets to play with. One time, my grandfather and I went to search for new finds with a metal detector. About 70 meters from the edge of the forest, the Germans built a system of trenches and a few small concrete bunkers. Each of them looked similar. A concrete room buried in the ground, about 5 to 6 square meters in size, with a small entrance. Surprisingly, the steel doors for closing the bunker were still there. I played with them many times, but I could never move them even by a centimeter, rusted to death. Things started to get strange when the sun began to dip behind the tree line. My grandfather and I decided to take a break and eat something inside the bunker. We did this often since the bunker served as a great landmark for us. We both started to feel very uneasy, and the temperature dropped to the point where steam was coming from our mouths. This was odd because it was midsummer, and nighttime temperatures usually didn't drop below 18 to 20 degrees Celsius. We didn't pay much attention to it and tried to rationalize it, thinking that the room was underground and damp. Then something happened that I can't explain logically, and my grandfather, despite being 96 years old now, the incident happened over 25 years ago, still remembers that moment clearly. After the temperature dropped, strange whispers started coming from the vestibule, where the steel entrance doors were. We told ourselves it was the wind and tried to ignore it. At that moment, the doors, which weighed over 100 kilograms, began to creak, and in a panic, we ran out, leaving all our gear behind. Once outside, the sense of unease disappeared as if by magic. Trying to rationalize what had happened, we calmed down, and my grandfather said he was going back for our gear. The moment my grandfather took a step toward the bunker, the doors slammed shut with such force that we felt the ground shake. We both ran away like madmen. That was the only time we experienced something like that, even though I spent much of my childhood in that forest. I had entered that bunker hundreds of times, and nothing unusual ever happened again. Archaeological studies around 2010 found a mass grave nearby, containing people from the surrounding villages who had been shot by Nazis. It's been almost 28 years since that day, and still I can't comprehend what happened. 11 Days of Cadet Camp Hell. First off, I would like to say that this is something that happened to me when I was 10 years old. I was living in a market town in mid-Wales when this occurred. To give a bit of a backstory, I had been living in mid-Wales since 2001 but moved back to England in 2011, so 10 years was how long I lived there, and this market town was between Welshpool and Barmouth. I had been with the cadets in Wales, and in 2007, there was a trip to Portsmouth, which is the only island city in the United Kingdom. I was at an encampment that was around 20 miles from Portsmouth, where I, along with the cadets, was put in dorms, and there were about 10 of us in these 2-story buildings. My bed was a camp bed with a bit of a metal cabinet and a small but very old side table, and then there were the other 2 cadets on either side of me. I did the usual exercises you do as a cadet. For example, we did a full 2-hour march and a stand at attention exercise, and afterwards we grabbed our lunch from this tiny and run-down hut, which was mostly always overcrowded, and you were only allowed to eat around the area of the hut, which kind of annoyed me as I kept to myself. Now here is where strange things started happening. I was out in the woods with some cadets and our assigned drill sergeant, and we were told to learn about cover and hide, which is sort of the equivalent of being taught how to set up an ambush and where to either hide or find appropriate cover. I was briefly lost after everyone split up. When I was in hiding, I heard twigs snapping and thought it was one of the other cadets on my team or the opponents we were to ambush. Nobody was there, so I brushed it off as probably a deer, as it was in quite a rural area where we were doing this exercise, but then I heard it again, only this time closer. When I looked, I still saw nothing, although this was during the early afternoon. I was freaking out and made as best as I could a stealth run back to where the place of meeting was only to ruin the activity. The other cadets were annoyed at me, and I told my assigned drill sergeant about what happened and what I heard, but he brushed it off as my imagination. What did I expect? A 10-year-old could have an overreactive imagination. We were then told we were setting up camp for the night, and I was a little more comfortable knowing people were around. I was told who I was camping with, and it was 2 boys in other cadet units. On that night we were being given a lesson on the way the Army set up camps in the woods when they are in the middle of a battlefield and for recon too. I happened to glance off into the distance as the forest, including the grass through it, was seeable under the dimly lit moonlight and looked like something off a painting. I was not paying attention and was listening to the lieutenant talking to us when I saw the outline of a shadowy figure walking across the grass from one side of the forest to the other side. At first I thought it was probably a reflection off the trees and the moon, but it was a silhouette of a man. He looked towards me, and in a kind of mind voice, it said, "When you die, you will burn in hell." I was trembling and scared when one of the sergeants looked at me and saw me looking out. She came over and asked me if I was all right. Now I was quite a sensitive boy and was upset very easily. I was weeping my eyes out of the sight of the other cadets in the back of a parked minibus as I was overcome with emotion and scared. I was able to sit out the lesson and spoke to my dad. He told me I was being overreactive and to calm down, but I could not. I then told him I wanted to go home but missed my chance to when a former friend of mine went home with his mom 2 days into the 11-day stay. 2 days later, there was a party in the hall in the complex, and I was there for a couple of hours, as it was not really a disco party with a DJ and a bar. Just a drink stand and a CD player hooked up to speakers playing the recent albums that came out. I then headed back alone to the dorm I was sleeping in while the others were at the party or around the complex. My dorm was on the other side of the complex, and I knew I had a walk ahead of me. As I headed back towards my dorm, I saw a woman in a cadet uniform looking away from me near the girls-only dorms. I asked her if she was alright, to which she replied in an echo voice, "You should not be here," and then I saw it. Her bottom body was transparent, and I freaked out, making a run back to the door, pounding at the door and windows until a cadet who I spoke to let me in, and I went straight to the dorm I was staying in. I did not sleep a wink that night. It was the 10th day and the final night before I went back to Mid-Wales. I was relieved and decided to make this day count as it was my last day. The day was fairly relaxed, like a reward ceremony and a raft trip including canoeing and rock climbing. That day flew by, and it was almost night. I went back to my dorm feeling happy it was the last night, and the room on the other end of the building from our dorm decided to have a go on an Ouija board and invited me along, which I kindly declined and went to sleep. Over 2 hours later, after falling asleep, I awoke to a noise of footsteps on the wooden floor and tapping on the walls, which I thought was the other dorm being in a wind-up mood, as they had shockingly shared a spliff, although they were between 12 and 14, so it was not really a surprise. Then, when they carried on, I looked outside the door only to see the door closed, so I brushed it off and went back to sleep. Then another 30 minutes later it started up again, only this time it was in the dorm I was sleeping in. I thought it was one of the cadets, but apart from me and 2 other cadets who were asleep, the beds were vacant and nobody was moving around. I fell back asleep, and then not long after falling back asleep, the room got cold, and I mean freezing cold. I was frightened as the windows were locked and could only open with a key. I looked up at the door after feeling like my legs were frozen, and I saw it. In the right corner of the ajar door was the upper half of a man looking in on us with nothing but the shape of his upper torso and his head. He looked at me, and I whispered over to the other cadet next to me if he saw it, but like the other ones before, he brushed it off as me seeing things. I thought it was pretty ironic how I was seeing this ghost or thing when the other dorms across were messing around with an Ouija board. This thing just stared at me and then vanished into the darkness. I did not sleep for the rest of the night after that, and finally I knew it was time to go home. All the cadets said goodbye to one another, including a few who tried to photograph me, but I hated being photographed, so when it was all said and done, the coach left Portsmouth, and I went back home. Now looking back at those 11 days at that encampment as I type this, I can only think of one thing from those 11 days, and that is, why would I burn in hell? What was the meaning behind those occurrences, and why was I the only one who saw and heard all that happened? Maybe they knew it was haunted and wanted to keep it hidden, or maybe other things were afoot when I entered and they left. Nothing has happened since, but those 11 days are days that hell came to me.